Whispers echo through candlelit corridors, where royal daughters were trained not just in embroidery and etiquette, but in silence. Behind the locked doors of castles and convents, some medieval princesses discovered secret worlds of knowledge, books banned by kings, manuscripts hidden by tutors, and ideas that could append thrones. These young women, trapped between crowns and cloisters, carried forbidden wisdom like contraband in their minds. This is the untold story of how secret learning shaped royal daughters, and how the quiet rebellion of knowledge changed dynasties, faith, and the very fabric of power. In the castles, convents, and great halls of medieval Europe, the education of a princess followed a curriculum that was meticulously designed to serve dynastic purposes, rather than intellectual development. And while their brothers were groomed for the demands of kingship through studies in rhetoric, law, theology, and warfare, royal daughters were expected to master a narrow set of skills that reinforced their roles as ornaments of dynastic power, bearers of lineage, and instruments of political alliance. Their training was deliberate, shallow, and carefully controlled, because knowledge could be dangerous if it extended beyond the boundaries prescribed by custom, religion, and politics. From early childhood, usually beginning between the ages of 5 and 7, princesses were placed under the supervision of governesses, wet nurses, and female attendants, whose primary duty was to cultivate piety and obedience. Prayer formed the cornerstone of their days, often beginning before dawn in the chapel or private oratory, reciting the Psalms, the Pater Noster, and Marian devotions, and learning the rhythm of the liturgical calendar, manuscripts containing simple prayers and illuminated devotional books, sometimes produced especially for young noblewomen, reinforced their identity as spiritual for it was widely believed that a princess's most potent contribution to her family's fortunes was not intellectual authority, but the favor she might earn through God by her devotion and chastity. Embroidery was another pillar of their instruction. Not a trivial pursuit, but a symbolically loaded skill that reflected discipline, patience, and the ability to craft beauty in silence. Embroidered altarcloths, garments, and tapestries created by noblewomen survive from the medieval period, attesting to the importance of this art as both religious offering and political statement, since many bore family emblems or dynastic symbols. Alongside prayer and embroidery came music, often in the form of singing hymns, learning to play the harp or lute, and memorizing ballads that celebrated chivalric ideals, courtly love, or saints' lives. Music lessons reinforced refinement and provided the ability to participate in the ceremonial life of the court, where a princess was expected to embody grace. Manners and comportment, perhaps the most emphasized part of the silent curriculum, were enforced with relentless discipline, for the bearing of a princess was as much a political tool as her bloodline. She was instructed in how to walk slowly and elegantly, how to curtsy before her elders, how to keep her eyes lowered in modesty, and how to regulate her voice so that it was soft, measured, and devoid of defiance. Manuals, such as the courtesy books of the late Middle Ages, including works like the Book of the Civilized Man by Daniel of Beccles in England, or Italian treatises on comportment, circulated widely, prescribing not intellectual inquiry but the rules of dining, dressing, and speaking, all designed to reinforce hierarchy and obedience. Beyond these practical skills, literacy for princesses was often intentionally limited. While some were taught to read, especially the Psalter and basic religious texts, writing was less frequently encouraged, as the ability to correspond independently could provide dangerous autonomy in matters of politics. where princes might learn Latin to study law or scripture in its original form. Princesses were often restricted to the vernacular, their access to language designed to be devotional rather than intellectual. The contrast was stark. A royal son in the 12th or 13th century might be trained by scholars in philosophy, canon law, and the art of governance, while his sister in the same household would spend her days with the psalter, the needle, and the lute, her horizons confined to personal piety and household management. The educational disparity was intentional, rooted in the prevailing belief that women were intellectually inferior and morally fragile, as reflected in the writings of clerics such as Peter, Lombard, or later echoed by scholastic thinkers who reinforced the idea that women's learning must be curtailed for the stability of society. Marriage was the inevitable destiny that shaped this curriculum. A princess was a diplomatic asset, and her worth was tied less to her knowledge than to her chastity, obedience, and ability to bear heirs. Instruction in household management, the supervision of servants, the storage of food, the maintenance of textiles prepared her for the role of running a noble or royal household, skills essential for the smooth functioning of a court, but rarely recorded in chronicles. This utilitarian education also underscored the political function of a princess: to support, never to lead; to complement, never to command. Yet within this framework, glimpses of intellectual ambition sometimes surfaced. Figures like Anna Kalnin, the Byzantine princess who wrote the Alexiad in the 12th century, or Christine de Pizan, though not royal, who advocated for women's education in France, stand as reminders that some women managed to transcend the curriculum designed to contain them. Still, such cases were exceptional and often faced resistance. For the majority, the silence of their education was deliberate, a curriculum designed not to enlighten but to constrain. The cloister was often an extension of this educational path. Many princesses, particularly younger daughters without strong marriage prospects, were sent to convents, where their instruction deepened in prayer and devotional reading but remained constrained. Convents could be sites of literacy and manuscript production, but for princesses placed within them, the emphasis remained on obedience to abbesses and the strict regulation of thought. The daily rhythm of hours of prayer, needlework, and music in monastic life mirrored the curriculum of the court, reinforcing the same themes of discipline and silence. It was only in rare cases, such as Hildegard of Bingen, though she was not a princess, that convent learning produced original scholarship and visionary writings. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the curriculum began to shift, influenced by humanism and the growing presence of printed books. Noble women in Italy, Spain, and later England and France began to receive broader educations, though often still framed within the language of piety and virtue. Isabella of Castile, for example, was tutored in Latin and statecraft, while her daughter Catherine of Aragon carried this tradition into England, influencing the education of her daughter Mary Tudor. Yet even in these cases, the tension remained. Learning was acceptable insofar as it reinforced dynastic and religious authority, but dangerous if it veered into independence or heresy. The silent curriculum remained the baseline expectation, a set of prescribed skills designed to maintain order, enforce obedience, and prevent the unsettling consequences of independent thought. The education of medieval princesses, therefore, was less about personal growth than about control, less about discovery than about discipline. Embroidery, prayer, music, and manners created a surface of refinement that masked the deeper restrictions imposed upon them. It was a curriculum of silence, a deliberate shaping of minds to serve dynasties rather than challenge them. And it set the stage for the quiet rebellions of knowledge that would emerge when some princesses, against expectation, reached for books that were never meant to be in their hands. In medieval Europe, the boundaries of what a princess could read were carefully guarded. For books were not mere vessels of ink and parchment, but carriers of authority, heresy, and rebellion, and access to them was often seen as access to dangerous power, which is why the curriculum for royal daughters deliberately restricted reading to the Psalter, devotional manuals, and saintly hagiography, while entire worlds of knowledge in philosophy, natural science, political theory, and theology were declared unsuitable for female eyes. Literacy among princesses was therefore tolerated only within narrow limits, because to read beyond the sanctioned texts risked exposure to ideas that could undermine dynastic control or religious orthodoxy. The forbidden corpus included classical authors whose works re-emerged in Europe during the 12th century: Renaissance, Aristotle, Plato, and Galen, whose philosophies of nature, metaphysics, and medicine were thought improper for women, not only because they required advanced study in Latin and Greek, but also because they contained interpretations of the universe that could spark intellectual independence. Equally guarded were legal texts such as the Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian or canon law commentaries, for mastery of such material meant entry into governance, diplomacy, or clerical authority, domains reserved exclusively for men. Religious writings outside official orthodoxy were especially perilous. The works of John Wycliffe in England or Jan Hus in Bohemia challenged papal authority and church hierarchy, and their spread through clandestine manuscripts led authorities to view any unsanctioned reading as potential heresy, while mystical texts, though occasionally tolerated in convents, could still be deemed suspect if they encouraged direct communion with God outside clerical mediation. Medical and scientific treatises, many transmitted through Arabic translations in Spain and Sicily, also fell into the category of forbidden learning. Works of Avicenna ibn Sina or Avros ibn Rushd circulated in universities and among scholars, but were rarely placed in the hands of women, especially royal women, because they not only conveyed advanced knowledge of astronomy, physics, and medicine, but also hinted at intellectual traditions beyond Christendom, which conservative clerics feared would corrupt the faith of impressionable minds. The circulation of books itself was tightly controlled in this era before printing, for manuscripts were expensive, hand-copied over months or years, and often chained in monastic libraries to prevent theft, meaning that access was not only an issue of gender but also of privilege. Yet for a princess who possessed wealth and proximity to scholars, the temptation to reach for what was forbidden was real, and history records scattered but striking instances of royal daughters exposed to texts far beyond their prescribed limits. In Byzantium, Anna Komnene, daughter of Emperor Alexios I, grew up with access to her father's court library and studied philosophy, astronomy, and medicine under private tutors, later composing the Alexiad in the 12th century, a historical account unique, not only for its authorship by a princess, but also for its intellectual depth, reflecting familiarity with works that, in the Latin West, would have been restricted. In France, Marguerite de Navarre, sister of King Francis I in the 16th century, although slightly beyond the medieval period, became associated with humanist learning and reformist theology, her writings and patronage of Protestant thinkers earning both admiration and suspicion. illustrating the fine line royal women walked when they engaged with unsanctioned texts. Even earlier, in the 13th century, Blanche of Castile, Queen Consort of France and mother of Louis IX, commissioned illuminated manuscripts such as the Moralized Bibles, richly illustrated works that not only conveyed scripture but also encoded allegories with political resonance, showing how queens and princesses could shape dynastic ideology through the medium of texts. These examples, though rare, point to the reality that knowledge was never fully contained, and the hunger for learning could pierce through barriers of censorship, the suspicion toward female readers was not merely about theology or philosophy, but also about control of the written word as a political weapon. Letters, chronicles, and treatises offered avenues of influence that authorities sought to deny women. The case of Eleanor of Aquitaine in the 12th century reveals how literacy and exposure to literature could alter a princess's role. Eleanor presided over courts where troubadour poetry flourished, blending themes of love, loyalty, and political commentary. And though much of this literature was sung rather than read, her patronage reflected a familiarity with cultural texts that unsettled clerical critics. Troubadour poetry and later chivalric romances, such as the tales of Arthurian knights and courtly love found in the works of Chrétien de Troyes, were sometimes deemed inappropriate for women, because they contained themes of passion, betrayal, and moral ambiguity that contradicted the rigid models of piety set out for royal daughters. These romances, however, circulated widely in courts, and it is inconceivable that princesses remained entirely shielded from them, raising questions about how they interpreted narratives of love and power in contrast to the restrained curriculum imposed upon them by the later Middle Ages. The rise of universities and the influx of Aristotelian philosophy into Western Europe created a new body of restricted knowledge, often labeled arts or sciences, which were explicitly defined as male domains. University statutes prohibited female students, and while some noblewomen circumvented these barriers through private tutors, the general rule persisted: advanced learning was to remain forbidden. The danger of women's intellectual independence was underscored by clerical writings, most notoriously by the Dominican inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, who in the late 15th century co-authored the Malleus Maleficarum, a treatise on witchcraft that tied women's supposed intellectual weakness and moral frailty to heresy and magic, reinforcing the association between forbidden knowledge and female danger. Though Kramer's work came slightly after the medieval period, it reflected anxieties that had long governed educational boundaries to allow women, particularly royal daughters, access to unsanctioned books was to risk the disruption of established order. Nevertheless, the attraction of knowledge persisted, often transmitted through tutors who quietly introduced princesses to broader subjects. In Spain, Isabella I of Castile received instruction in Latin, a rarity among women of her time, enabling her to engage with statecraft more effectively and to navigate theological disputes during the Reconquista and early Inquisition. In England, Catherine of Aragon, her daughter, received a similarly advanced education and later ensured that her own daughter, Mary Tudor, studied Latin, Greek, and humanist texts. The deliberate broadening of education for select princesses in the late medieval and Renaissance periods reveals that forbidden books were not simply locked away forever, but their access remained conditional, fragile, and fraught with risk. At the same time, censorship mechanisms grew harsher, particularly as the printing press revolutionized access to texts after 1450. what had once been rare. Manuscripts circulating quietly among courts became printed volumes capable of mass distribution, and this transformation heightened the anxiety over women's reading. Lists of prohibited books, such as the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, established by the Catholic Church in the 16th century, codified restrictions that had already existed informally for centuries. For princesses, this meant their libraries were curated, monitored, and purged of anything that might lead to independent thought. Yet the very existence of these indexes and censorship campaigns attests to the fact that forbidden reading was already occurring. Knowledge was slipping into hands that authorities never intended it to reach, the forbidden. Books of medieval Europe thus symbolized the tension between power and vulnerability in the education of royal daughters, while embroidery, prayer, and music produced obedient symbols of dynastic virtue. The hidden presence of manuscripts in philosophy, theology, and science suggested another path, one of autonomy, influence, and intellectual rebellion. Though few princesses openly defied the limits placed upon them, the whispers of forbidden learning shaped their perceptions, informed their marriages, and in some cases altered the trajectories of kingdoms. By controlling access to books, dynasties sought to control not only what their daughters knew, but also what they could imagine. And it was in that imagination, sparked by glimpses of knowledge never meant for them, that the seeds of quiet defiance were sown. Behind the glittering ceremonies of medieval courts, where princesses were paraded as embodiments of dynastic honor, there existed another, quieter presence, the figures who risked careers, reputations, and sometimes their very lives to expand the intellectual horizons of royal daughters beyond the narrow curriculum of prayer, embroidery, and etiquette. These secret tutors were often clerics, humanists, exiled scholars, or even politically astute queens and noblewomen, and their work shaped not only the minds of individual princesses, but also the destinies of entire dynasties. In the Middle Ages, formal education for women was tightly circumscribed, yet evidence survives that some daughters of kings and dukes were deliberately exposed to advanced studies under the guidance of private mentors. In the Byzantine world, Anna Komnene provides one of the most striking examples. Born in 1083 to Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, she was not only permitted but encouraged by her mother, Irene Duquesne, to study philosophy, astronomy, and medicine under leading scholars of Constantinople. And though her access was not officially forbidden, the breadth of her education reveals the presence of tutors who operated at the edge of accepted custom, granting her access to Aristotle and Galen, knowledge typically reserved for men destined for public office or university study. In Western Europe, the evidence is more fragmentary, yet glimpses appear in chronicles, correspondence, and surviving manuscripts. Some tutors were clerics attached to royal households whose duty included instructing princesses in piety, but who, recognizing intellectual potential, introduced them to Latin grammar or theological debate. Others were humanist scholars drawn into the courts of Italy, France, and Spain in the 14th and 15th centuries, whose devotion to the revival of classical learning sometimes overcame traditional reservations about educating women. The risk for these tutors was not trivial. The transmission of unsanctioned knowledge could be construed as heresy, sedition, or simply subversion of the patriarchal order. The English Lollards, followers of John Wycliffe in the late 14th century, faced execution for translating scripture into the vernacular, and any tutor who provided royal daughters access to such works would have faced swift retribution. Even beyond heresy, the danger lay in equipping women with intellectual tools that could influence politics. A princess trained in rhetoric and history might become a formidable negotiator in dynastic marriages. And while this could benefit her family, it could also destabilize fragile alliances. For this reason, most tutoring took place discreetly, folded into the acceptable framework of religious or linguistic instruction. Latin, for example, was taught under the pretext of deepening devotional practice, since reading the Psalms or liturgical texts in their original language could be framed as piety. Yet once a princess gained command of Latin, a door opened to the writings of Cicero, Augustine, or Boethius, each carrying implications far beyond prayer. Not all secret tutors were men. In many cases, queens and noblewomen acted as mentors to their daughters and wards, transmitting knowledge they themselves had acquired against expectation. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of both France and England in the 12th century, famously presided over courts that cultivated troubadour poetry and the ideals of courtly love. And while she may not have personally tutored her daughters, her patronage created an environment in which exposure to literature was inevitable. Later, Isabella of Castile in the 15th century ensured that her daughters, including Catherine of Aragon, received advanced humanist instruction, drawing upon tutors like Alessandro Geraldini, who taught Latin, history, and moral philosophy. Catherine would later bring this education to England, where it influenced the intellectual environment of the Tudor court and the upbringing of her daughter. Mary Tudor, similarly, Margaret of York, Duchess of Burgundy in the 15th century, maintained a court renowned for its library and support of humanist learning. And her stepdaughter, Mary of Burgundy, benefited from this atmosphere, which subtly subverted the expectation that noblewomen should remain confined to devotional reading. In Italy, where the Renaissance reshaped educational ideals, tutors of royal and noble daughters often emerged from circles of humanist scholars. Guarino da Verona and Vittorino da Feltre, two leading educators of the 15th century, are recorded as having taught both boys and girls in their academies, insisting that the female mind was no less capable of grasping grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy. Although their female pupils were often the daughters of dukes rather than reigning kings, the precedent they established extended to royal households, where ambitious mothers sought similar training for their daughters. The Sforza and Est courts in northern Italy became hubs where princesses such as Isabella d'Este and her sister Beatrice were schooled in Latin, literature, and political history, equipping them to become among the most influential women of Renaissance Europe. In these contexts, the tutors themselves often argued that educating women strengthened dynasties, as an educated wife or daughter could serve as a more effective regent, patron, and interlocutor with foreign courts. Yet their arguments frequently had to be couched in terms of utility and morality rather than equality, since open advocacy of women's intellectual parity risked clerical opposition outside the elite courts of Italy and Spain. However, secret tutoring was a more precarious endeavor. In Northern Europe, where the Reformation would soon transform religious life, early reformist ideas reached some princesses through private instruction. Marguerite de Navarre in France, sister to King Francis I, received exposure to reformist theology through tutors sympathetic to Protestantism. And though she wielded her position to protect religious thinkers, her association with unsanctioned texts provoked suspicion from both the Sorbonne and the papacy. In England, Lady Jane Grey, later known as the 9 Days, Queen, grew up in the mid-16th century under the instruction of John Aylmer and Roger Ascham. humanist scholars who emphasized classical literature, philosophy, and Protestant theology. Jane's education made her one of the most erudite women of her age, but it also marked her as a dangerous figure in the volatile politics of Tudor succession, ultimately leading to her execution. While Jane belongs to the cusp of the Renaissance and Reformation, her story underscores the long-standing tension between princesses educated beyond their prescribed roles and the instability their learning could generate. The survival of manuscripts, annotated by royal daughters, provides rare glimpses of these secret tutors at work. Marginal notes in prayer books, corrections in Latin grammars, or personal mottos inscribed in margins suggest guidance from teachers who encouraged intellectual engagement. Christine de Pizan, though not a princess herself, became one of the first professional female authors in France and directly advocated for the education of noblewomen in her Book of the City of Ladies 1405, arguing that history itself demonstrated women's capacity for wisdom when given instruction. Her works were read at courts across Europe, and some princesses may have absorbed her defense of female learning under the guidance of sympathetic tutors. The relationship between tutor and pupil was often one of quiet resistance to social norms. For the tutor, offering advanced instruction to a princess could mean aligning with a faction within the court that sought to expand her influence. Or it could simply reflect a personal conviction that intellect should not be wasted. For the princess, receiving this instruction meant navigating a delicate balance between obedience to her official role and private curiosity. In many cases, their learning remained hidden, revealed only in adulthood when they demonstrated unexpected fluency in debate, correspondence, or governance. Queens who acted as regents, such as Blanche of Castile for her son Louis IX, or later Catherine de Medici in France, often drew upon training that exceeded what was supposedly allowed. And though their tutors remain shadowy figures in the historical record, the imprint of their influence is visible in the competence and confidence of their royal pupils. What united these diverse cases, from Byzantium to Burgundy, from Castile to England, was the sense that tutoring princesses in forbidden or advanced subjects carried profound consequences. It was a quiet defiance of cultural norms, sometimes tolerated when it served dynastic strength, sometimes condemned when it threatened established order. The tutors themselves often disappear from history, their names preserved only in passing references. Yet their legacy is found in the intellectual resilience of the women they taught. These shadows behind the throne remind us that the silent curriculum of piety and obedience was never absolute. It was constantly challenged by those who believed that royal daughters could and should know more than their families and societies intended. Theirs was a dangerous vocation, one that straddled loyalty and subversion, and without them, the story of women's intellectual presence in medieval and Renaissance courts would be far thinner. To understand what it meant for a medieval princess to study forbidden or advanced subjects, one must begin not with abstractions, but with the physical reality of books themselves. For in the centuries before the printing press transformed European learning, manuscripts were costly, rare, and often chained in monastic libraries, their production requiring teams of scribes, illuminators and binders working for months or years, meaning that a single book could represent the value of an estate. Thus, when a royal daughter managed to obtain and read one outside her prescribed devotional texts, the act was more than curiosity, it was a logistical triumph, an act of deliberate defiance against barriers of cost, access, and surveillance. The psalter, or book of hours placed in a young princess's hands, was richly decorated, portable, and designed to reinforce piety. Yet within the same libraries and courts existed manuscripts that carried the writings of Aristotle, Cicero, Boethius, or Avros. And it was these volumes, often borrowed, smuggled, or copied in fragments, that became the hidden companions of some royal daughters. In convent and castles alike, a princess's exposure to such texts depended on the cooperation of tutors, librarians, or sympathetic relatives. Records from aristocratic households reveal that books were sometimes kept in private cabinets or strongboxes, while marginal notes in women's devotional books suggest that secular or philosophical material was interleaved or disguised within orthodox covers, a strategy to avoid suspicion. Candlelight was the constant companion of this clandestine learning. Since study often occurred at night or in secluded chambers, the flickering light straining the eyes but shielding the activity from the watchful gaze of guardians or confessors who might denounce such pursuits as vanity, heresy, or disobedience. The physical act of reading in hiding required ingenuity. In some cases, manuscripts were written in small script on portable parchment codices that could be concealed beneath garments or tucked into embroidery chests, their presence easily disguised amid acceptable devotional material. Inventories from noble households in France, Burgundy, and England list books of chivalric romance or classical philosophy recorded as miscellanea or histories, labels vague enough to conceal their true nature, suggesting that families were aware of the ambiguity yet tolerated it when politically advantageous. For a princess, however, tolerance was precarious. If a book associated with heresy were discovered in her possession, it could not only damage her reputation but endanger the standing of her entire dynasty. Thus, learning often required silent collaboration with attendants who turned a blind eye, or with scribes who copied excerpts of larger works into smaller, more concealable booklets. These excerpts might contain a single dialogue of Plato, a medical recipe attributed to Galen, or a commentary on law, and though fragmentary, they opened intellectual doorways beyond the sanctioned curriculum. Evidence for this hidden engagement can be traced in the survival of annotated manuscripts owned by noble women. The prayer book of Anne of Brittany, Queen of France at the turn of the 16th century, contains marginalia that indicate not only devotion but also familiarity with broader theological debates, suggesting she read beyond what was officially prescribed. Earlier, the libraries of the Visconti and Sforza princesses of Milan reveal collections that included Dante and Boccaccio, their works blending moral philosophy with literature that carried political undertones. Even where inventories list only devotional texts, the decoration and commentary often reveal coded references to secular concerns, implying that books functioned as layered instruments of education. In the case of Catherine of Aragon, her tutors ensured she was literate in Latin and acquainted with humanist writings. And though these were not forbidden by the early 16th century, her retention of devotional volumes, alongside classical texts, underscores how the line between sanctioned and hidden learning blurred as political contexts shifted beyond libraries. The materiality of books shaped the experience of secret study. Manuscripts were heavy, bound in leather, with clasps that creaked when opened, their pages made of parchment that carried the smell of animal skin, their inks mixed from oak gall, lampblack, and vermilion. To turn these pages in solitude was to feel the weight of centuries and the danger of possession. For every book was traceable to a patron, scribe, or library, royal daughters who engaged with them did so with full awareness of their rarity and fragility. In some convents, nuns devised ingenious ways to circulate texts. Letters survive from communities in Germany and the Low Countries, describing books being passed from cloister to cloister under the guise of liturgical exchanges. And though these accounts rarely name princesses, many royal women spent years in such convents as part of their upbringing, making it highly plausible that they encountered wider reading than official records admit. When they returned to court, they sometimes carried this knowledge with them in the form of small, portable codices, treasures that could be hidden in travel trunks or gifted discreetly to trusted companions. One of the most striking aspects of hidden learning is how physical concealment intersected with intellectual disguise. Texts could be allegorized or presented under devotional pretexts. For example, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy was widely read in medieval Europe. But for women, its presence could be justified as moral guidance rather than philosophy proper. Similarly, Ovid's Metamorphoses, filled with mythological narratives, could be reframed as allegories of virtue and vice, permitting their circulation in courts while still transmitting material that broadened the imagination of readers. Princesses who encountered these texts did so under the veil of acceptability, yet the experience of reading them privately, outside the formal curriculum, transformed their intellectual world, giving them tools of thought and language that were otherwise denied. The arrival of the printing press in the mid-15th century altered the physical reality dramatically. Suddenly, books became cheaper, smaller, and more portable, expanding both access and anxiety. For royal daughters, this meant that the scope of potential reading widened beyond the rare illuminated manuscript to include printed pamphlets, treatises, and vernacular translations of scripture. While this development lies partly beyond the high medieval period, its roots were already laid in the clandestine circulation of manuscripts centuries earlier. By the time Margaret of Navarre assembled her library in the early 16th century, or when Elizabeth I of England corresponded with scholars in Latin and Greek, the hidden practices of medieval princesses had created a precedent for female engagement with forbidden learning. The physical reality, the candlelit chambers, the disguised bindings, the marginal annotations formed the foundation of a cultural transformation that would only fully reveal itself with the spread of print. The risks of discovery remained constant. Chronicles mention cases where noble women were reprimanded for reading romances deemed unsuitable, or where manuscripts associated with heresy were confiscated from private households. The Council of Toulouse in 1229 forbade lapidation, including noble women, from possessing copies of the Bible in the vernacular, highlighting the Church's determination to control the spread of Scripture. For a princess, violation of such decrees could be framed not as personal error but as political defiance, with consequences for her family's standing with Rome. The fear of discovery infused the very act of turning a page with tension, for knowledge was not simply intellectual but political currency. The silence of a princess's chamber might conceal both prayer and rebellion, her embroidery frame resting beside a manuscript that carried the voices of ancient philosophers or reformist theologians. The material world of hidden learning also extended beyond the book itself to the instruments of study. Wax, tablets, and styluses allowed for temporary notes that could be erased, a discreet way to practice Latin conjugations or copy passages without leaving incriminating evidence. Some manuscripts contain palimpsests, earlier texts scraped away and overwritten, suggesting the recycling of parchment could also serve as a cover for transmitting new material under old forms. The survival of these artifacts offers modern historians tantalizing glimpses of the invisible world of female study. Princesses, bound by duty and surveillance, engaged with these objects in ways that blurred devotion and defiance, compliance and curiosity. Ultimately, the physical reality of learning in hiding underscores the paradox of medieval female education. While official curricula confined princesses to obedience, the very structures of aristocratic and monastic culture provided cracks through which knowledge seeped. Libraries, convents, scribes, and tutors became conduits for texts that were never meant for female eyes. And the sensory experience of reading them, the feel of parchment, the flicker of candlelight, the scratch of quills, the faint scent of ink and vellum carried both danger and exhilaration. These material encounters shaped how royal daughters engaged with the world, equipping some to wield unexpected influence in politics, religion, and culture. Their books were not abstract symbols, but tangible companions, objects of risk and desire, hidden in strong boxes, wrapped in cloth, passed hand to hand in whispered trust. Through them, the silent curriculum of obedience was challenged by a parallel curriculum. The education of medieval and early Renaissance princesses was rarely the result of impersonal institutions alone. More often, it was profoundly shaped by their mothers, the queens and noble consorts who acted as gatekeepers of acceptable knowledge. For these women, positioned at the intersection of dynastic ambition and cultural expectation, determined whether their daughters would remain confined within the narrow bounds of the silent curriculum or be granted access to wider learning. And the decisions they made reverberated across generations. In many courts, queens reinforced tradition, ensuring their daughters embodied piety, obedience, and domestic skill, the very virtues that secured dynastic alliances through marriage. Yet in other cases, queens actively promoted learning, arranging tutors, commissioning books, and even overseeing intellectual circles that broadened the horizons of female education. Their influence was both personal and political. Personal, because maternal example shaped a daughter's outlook on knowledge, and political, because a well-educated princess could become either an asset or a liability in the game of dynastic power. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most formidable queens of the 12th century, exemplifies this dual role. Twice a queen, first of France and then of England, Eleanor presided over courts that became centers of literature, patronizing troubadours and poets whose works celebrated chivalry and courtly love, though direct evidence of Eleanor's own literacy is debated. Her cultural patronage created an environment where her daughters Marie of France, Countess of Champagne, and Eleanor of England, Queen of Castile, absorbed a familiarity with literature and the prestige of intellectual exchange, a legacy that outlived her and positioned her female descendants as active participants. In Europe's literary culture, other queens exercised even more direct control over their daughters' education. Blanche of Castile, queen consort of Louis VIII of France and mother of Louis IX, ensured her daughters were raised in strict piety, but also surrounded them with devotional texts of extraordinary richness. While Blanche emphasized obedience and prayer, her personal involvement in commissioning manuscripts suggests that she saw books not only as instruments of devotion, but as symbols of dynastic legitimacy. Her daughter, Isabella of France, married into the English court and became Queen of England, where her literacy and exposure to French cultural traditions influenced her controversial career. In Castile and Aragon, mothers wielded similar authority. Isabella I of Castile, herself educated in Latin and exposed to humanist ideas, arranged for her daughters, including Catherine of Aragon, Juana of Castile, and Maria of Aragon, to receive rigorous instruction in languages, theology, and courtly skills. Catherine carried this learning to England, where it influenced the upbringing of her daughter Mary Tudor, who grew fluent in Latin and engaged with humanist texts under the guidance of tutors like Juan Luis. Isabella's choices illustrate how a queen's commitment to education could reshape the intellectual climate of an entire court, while also raising tensions with clerics who feared the implications of female access to advanced learning. Not all queens, however, favored expansion. Many enforced the boundaries of the silent curriculum, often out of genuine belief that deviation threatened morality and stability. The chronicler Matthew Paris recorded that some English queens maintained close surveillance over their daughters' reading, permitting only psalters, saintly lives, and moral treatises. In such cases, queens acted as enforcers of patriarchal norms, sometimes more stringently than kings, since their reputations as virtuous mothers depended on producing obedient and chaste daughters. Queens also bore the weight of dynastic failure if their daughters displayed independence or fell into scandal. Thus, restricting learning was a defensive measure as much as a cultural assumption. The example of Margaret of Anjou, Queen Consort of Henry VI of England, reveals this tension. While Margaret was politically astute and personally literate, her embattled position during the Wars of the Roses made it unlikely that she would encourage her daughter-in-law or wards to pursue dangerous intellectual autonomy. Queens caught in civil wars or political instability often suppressed learning for fear it might arm daughters with opinions or loyalties that could deepen factional divisions. Elsewhere, queens acted as intellectual patrons while shielding their daughters from direct association with controversial works. Catherine de' Medici, Queen Consort of France in the 16th century, presided over a court filled with scholars, astrologers, and reformist thinkers. Yet her daughters were primarily educated in conventional devotion and dynastic diplomacy, reflecting Catherine's awareness of the risks of intellectual radicalism during the wars of religion. In contrast, her contemporary Marguerite de Navarre, sister of King Francis I, directly nurtured reformist ideas and circulated her own writings, including the Heptameron, which blended literary innovation with theological reflection. Though technically not a queen consort, Marguerite functioned as a maternal figure within her family network, and her encouragement of women's intellectual pursuits influenced nieces and protégées who later played roles in the spread of Protestant thought in France and Navarre in Italy. The Renaissance provided fertile ground for maternal gatekeeping in education. Isabella d'Este of Mantua, celebrated as the First Lady of the Renaissance, cultivated one of the most renowned courts of the early 16th century, patronizing artists like Leonardo da Vinci and scholars who revived classical learning. Her daughters benefited from this intellectual atmosphere, absorbing languages, music, and the arts. Their education designed not only to refine them personally, but to enhance the prestige of the Este dynasty. Similarly, Lucretia Borgia, though infamous in rumor and political propaganda, acted as a patron of learning in Ferrara, where her children were exposed to one of the richest cultural courts in Italy. These cases reveal how queens, themselves beneficiaries of unconventional educations, transmitted intellectual legacies to their daughters in ways that subtly challenged societal expectations. The power of mothers as gatekeepers also extended into convents. Many queens placed their daughters temporarily in monastic institutions where the choice of abbey determined whether they would encounter only strict devotional routine or a richer literary environment. Queens who valued learning often selected convents known for manuscript production or reformist tendencies, while those more conservative opted for cloisters with reputations for discipline and silence. In either case, the maternal decision shaped the intellectual boundaries of a daughter's youth. For instance, Margaret of York, Duchess of Burgundy, placed her stepdaughter, Mary of Burgundy, in an environment where Burgundian manuscript culture flourished, surrounding her with books of devotion and history that reflected both orthodoxy and dynastic pride. Mary's subsequent patronage of illuminated manuscripts suggests that this exposure left a lasting imprint, demonstrating how maternal choices directed the cultural identity of future queens. The consequences of these maternal decisions were profound. Daughters who were allowed advanced education sometimes emerged as influential regents or patrons, altering the political and intellectual life of their courts. Elizabeth I of England, though her direct maternal influence was cut short by the execution of Anne Boleyn, benefited indirectly from her mother's humanist connections and the culture of learning fostered by Catherine of Aragon before her, leaving her equipped to rule as one of the most intellectually engaged monarchs of the early modern period. Conversely, daughters denied broader instruction often left little trace in cultural history, their lives reduced to dynastic marriages and silence, underscoring the role of queens as gatekeepers who could either open doors or close them permanently. Ultimately, the story of mothers and daughters in medieval and Renaissance courts reveals the uneven, contested nature of female education. Queens were not passive transmitters of patriarchal norms, but active agents who shaped, suppressed, or encouraged their daughters' access to knowledge based on personal belief, political calculation, and cultural context. Their decisions determined whether a princess remained confined within the silent curriculum of prayer and embroidery or stepped, however cautiously, into the wider world of books, philosophy, and politics. Through their choices, these women acted as both enforcers and challengers of tradition, reminding us that the gate to forbidden learning was often opened or locked not by kings or clerics, but by mothers who understood, more than anyone, the dangers and possibilities of knowledge in a daughter's hands. For a medieval princess, marriage was never merely a personal union, but a political instrument, the most valuable deployment of her existence in a dynastic world where alliances between kingdoms and principalities determined the survival or downfall of entire realms. And within this context, the role of learning carefully, cultivated, or cautiously suppressed became a subtle yet decisive weapon. The education a princess received shaped not only her ability to present herself as an attractive bride, but also her capacity to negotiate, influence, and endure in foreign courts. Officially, her value lay in lineage, dowry, and fertility, yet in practice, her reputation for intellect or ignorance could alter the balance of marriage negotiations, determine whether she became a pliant consort or a formidable regent, and affect the fortunes of her natal and marital dynasties. The chronicles of Europe are filled with examples where education, sometimes hidden, sometimes overt, was wielded as a strategic asset in marriage diplomacy. In Castile and Aragon, the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella deliberately emphasized the education of their daughters, who were married into the ruling houses of England, Portugal, and the Habsburg Empire. Catherine of Aragon, sent to England to marry Arthur Tudor and later Henry VIII, carried with her a humanist education steeped in Latin, theology, and the works of Erasmus. a background that enabled her to converse as an equal with scholars and churchmen, and to position herself as a patron of learning in England. This intellectual reputation enhanced her dignity as queen consort and later regent, winning her respect even in the midst of political crises. And it made her a symbol of cultural refinement that reflected positively on Spain's prestige. Similarly, Juana of Castile, remembered in history as Juana la Loca, was also deeply educated, her literacy in multiple languages preparing her for her marriage to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. Though Juana's later life was overshadowed by political conflict and personal tragedy, her education initially enhanced her role as a bridge between Iberia and the Habsburg Netherlands, equipping her to navigate the complexities of her foreign court. The role of learning as a marital weapon was not confined to Iberian princesses. In England, the daughters of Edward IV were educated with unusual thoroughness under the guidance of Elizabeth Woodville, their mother, and the humanist John Fisher. Elizabeth of York, who married Henry VII and became the mother of the Tudor dynasty, brought to her marriage not only Plantagenet blood, but also a reputation for cultivated piety and literacy, traits that helped stabilize a fragile union following decades of civil war. Later, her granddaughter Elizabeth I of England would epitomize the political utility of female learning, using her command of languages and scholarship in negotiations with foreign ambassadors, though her refusal to marry transformed that utility into a different kind of weapon, a deliberate defiance of the marital expectations imposed on princesses. In earlier centuries, Eleanor of Aquitaine's literacy and cultural patronage made her an especially valuable marriage prospect, first as Queen of France and later as Queen of England. And though her marriages were orchestrated by political necessity, her education allowed her to play an active role in diplomacy and to cultivate courts that projected refinement and authority. Marriage negotiations frequently referenced a princess's accomplishments in music, languages, or piety as part of her marriageability. Ambassadors sent to observe prospective brides often reported on their bearing, modesty, and learning. For instance, Habsburg envoys assessing Catherine of Aragon praised not only her beauty and lineage, but also her fluency in Latin and her skill in religious discourse. Such reports influenced kings and princes who weighed not only the dowry and alliance, but also the cultural prestige a bride might bring. Knowledge, therefore, was weaponized as a form of soft power. A literate and eloquent princess could elevate the reputation of her husband's court, while an ignorant or poorly trained bride could invite scorn. In Burgundy, Margaret of York's stepdaughter, Mary of Burgundy was prized not only for her inheritance, but also for her training in courtly skills, her literacy in French and Dutch, and her ability to embody the Burgundian court's reputation for splendor, making her marriage to Maximilian of Habsburg a union that carried both material and intellectual capital. Yet education also carried risks. A princess who demonstrated too much independence of thought could alarm prospective in-laws, suggesting that she might resist subordination to her husband. Queen's consort who wielded learning as authority sometimes provoked resentment, as seen in the case of Margaret of Anjou in England, whose political assertiveness during the reign of Henry VI was portrayed negatively in contemporary propaganda, even though her literacy and training in diplomacy were assets during her husband's bouts of incapacity. Similarly, in France, Catherine de' Medici's daughters were carefully trained in languages, etiquette, and theology, their educations designed to enhance their value in marriage alliances across Europe. But Catherine's own reputation as a politically astute and manipulative queen mother demonstrates the suspicion that could follow learned women in positions of power. Thus, while education could be a weapon to secure and sustain marriages, it could also backfire if perceived as threatening male dominance. The cultural expectations of foreign courts often shaped how a princess's education was received. In Italy, where humanist ideals flourished, a learned bride was admired as a mark of dynastic sophistication. Isabella d'Este's letters and patronage reveal how education in music, art, and languages enhanced her political authority and made her court in Mantua a center of Renaissance culture. In contrast, in Northern Europe, the boundaries remained stricter, and a princess's learning was expected to remain within devotional and moral limits. Yet even here, exceptions occurred. Christine de Pisan's advocacy for female education influenced French noblewomen, some of whom entered marriages with reputations for literacy and moral instruction that enhanced their status. In Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, evidence of female education is scarcer, but chronicles mention princesses trained in religious devotion whose marriages extended dynastic alliances into Poland, Hungary, and Russia, demonstrating that even limited literacy could function as a symbol of cultural refinement in political unions. The role of knowledge extended beyond the negotiation table into the lived reality of marriage itself. A princess trained in languages could correspond directly with foreign courts, reducing reliance on male intermediaries. A queen consort, literate in theology, could advise her husband on matters of religious policy, as Catherine of Aragon did during her regency in 1513 when Henry VIII campaigned in France. A princess familiar with history and law could invoke precedent in disputes over succession, as Elizabeth Woodville did when defending her children's claims during the Wars of the Roses. These examples reveal how education, once embedded within a marriage, could shape governance, diplomacy, and even warfare. The silent curriculum of prayer and obedience might prepare a princess to embody virtue, but the hidden curriculum of learning, when deployed within marriage, gave her tools to alter politics. Knowledge as a weapon in marriage was also visible in the realm of cultural patronage. Queen's consort, who sponsored poets, scholars, and artists, elevated the prestige of their husbands' courts, sometimes influencing policy indirectly through cultural means. Eleanor of Aquitaine's courts at Poitiers and Bordeaux shaped the culture of chivalry in both France and England. Isabella of Castile's sponsorship of Columbus and her theological advisors reflected her authority in shaping Spain's policies. Margaret of Navarre's patronage of reformist writers influenced the French Reformation, a legacy tied directly to the education she received and transmitted through her marriage into the House of Navarre. These cases demonstrate that the knowledge princesses carried into marriage was not merely ornamental but instrumental, capable of steering dynasties toward new cultural and political horizons. In the end, the education of royal daughters was always entangled with their destinies as brides. Their learning, whether limited to pious devotion or expanded to encompass philosophy, languages, and history, became a form of currency in dynastic politics. To some, it was a dowry of intellect, enhancing alliances and enriching courts. To others, it was a threat, a spark of independence that could destabilize patriarchal control. Yet across Europe, from the Byzantine Princess Anna Komnene to the Tudor queens of England, the pattern is unmistakable. Knowledge, when carried into marriage, was never neutral. It was wielded, consciously or unconsciously, as a weapon, sometimes sharpening the prestige of a dynasty, sometimes cutting against the grain of expectation, always leaving traces in the chronicles of power. In medieval and early Renaissance Europe, Theology was not merely an academic discipline, but the foundation of authority, shaping laws, legitimizing kingship, and defining the boundaries of orthodoxy and heresy, and for royal daughters. The study of theology was both the most accessible form of learning and the most perilous, for while prayer and piety were demanded of them, independent engagement with theological texts or ideas risked branding them as heretics, rebels, or even witches. The very subject most encouraged within the silent curriculum was also the one most tightly controlled when it moved beyond sanctioned devotion. Princesses were raised on psalters, books of hours, and saintly texts that emphasized obedience, humility, and intercessory prayer. But the line between approved theology and forbidden speculation was perilously thin, especially as debates over the nature of the Eucharist, papal authority, and scripture translation convulsed Europe from the 12th century onward. The Church itself defined the stakes. Councils and inquisitions declared heresy not only a spiritual error but a political crime, punishable by excommunication, imprisonment, or execution. For a princess, whose very identity embodied dynastic legitimacy, association with heretical theology could undermine the standing of entire kingdoms, which is why their exposure to theology was often carefully mediated by confessors and chaplains. Yet history records numerous instances where royal daughters encountered dangerous theological currents, sometimes by choice, sometimes by circumstance. In the 12th century, when the works of Peter Abelard and other scholastic theologians stirred controversy in Paris, theological speculation was largely confined to universities, but its ripples reached the courts, where noblewomen occasionally absorbed ideas through correspondence or patronage. Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughters, though not theologians themselves, moved in cultural circles where discussions of love, morality, and divine order blended with scholastic debates, and the suspicion toward women's capacity to engage with such matters grew in proportion to their visibility in court politics. The writings of Hildegard of Bingen, though she was an abbess and not a princess, illustrate both the possibility and danger of female theology. Her visionary works were praised by some as divinely inspired, yet scrutinized by others as dangerously unorthodox. Princesses raised in convents often encountered such tensions firsthand. Convents were both sites of devotion and hubs of intellectual exchange, producing manuscripts that circulated theological commentary and mystical texts. But a royal daughter who engaged too deeply could find her reputation endangered by the late Middle Ages. The rise of reformist movements brought theology into even sharper conflict with dynastic politics. The Lollards in England, inspired by John Wycliffe in the late 14th century, translated the Bible into the vernacular and denounced clerical corruption, insisting that scripture should be accessible to all believers. For women, including noblewomen and potentially royal daughters, this opened a door to direct theological engagement. But it was also perilous. The Council of Constance in 1415 condemned Wycliffe's writings and burned Jan Hus, another reformer, at the stake. Female association with such teachings invited accusations of sedition. Chronicles mention that Anne of Bohemia, queen consort of Richard II of England and sister to Wenceslas IV of Bohemia, was sympathetic to reformist theology circulating in Prague, though evidence is debated. Nevertheless, her marriage coincided with the spread of Lollardy in England, suggesting that royal marriages themselves could serve as conduits for dangerous ideas. The danger lay not only in reading reformist texts, but in being perceived as a patron of heterodox communities. for queens and princesses often maintained chapels and confessional networks that could harbor suspect preachers. The introduction of mystical and visionary theology also brought risks. Women who claimed direct visions from God, including some noble and royal women, could be celebrated as saints or condemned as heretics, depending on political circumstances. Joan of Arc, though not royal, epitomizes the peril of female religious authority in the early 15th century. Her trial and execution for heresy and witchcraft highlighted the deep suspicion with which clerical and secular powers regarded women claiming divine inspiration. For princesses, the line was clearer. Their role was to embody piety, not to interpret or innovate theology. Yet the temptation to explore deeper questions was ever present. The 15th century Princess Margaret of York, Duchess of Burgundy, commissioned devotional manuscripts that contained not only orthodox prayers but also moral commentaries with reformist undertones, suggesting her awareness of debates that later exploded into open conflict during the Reformation. The spread of humanism in the 15th and early 16th centuries further complicated the landscape. Humanist scholars such as Erasmus advocated for a return to scriptural sources, emphasizing the moral renewal of the Church, and their writings often circulated in courts. For princesses like Catherine of Aragon and her daughter Mary Tudor, exposure to Erasmus's theology was both an asset and a danger. It enhanced their reputations as educated women, but also linked them to currents of reform that could be weaponized by political enemies. When Mary Tudor attempted to restore Catholicism in England after her accession in 1553, her education in theology under both Catholic and humanist influences shaped her determination. But her religious policies earned her the moniker Bloody Mary from Protestant writers. Here, theology was no longer a private exercise but a political battlefield, and royal daughters became both symbols and agents of competing. Confessional visions. The Reformation intensified the stakes. Princesses and queens consort across Europe found themselves on the front lines of religious wars, their educations in theology shaping their roles. Marguerite de Navarre in France openly supported reformist thinkers, using her court as a haven for Protestant writers, while carefully maintaining her Catholic loyalty in public. Her niece, Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, became a committed Calvinist, her theological convictions placing her in direct opposition to Catholic monarchies. In England, Elizabeth I's mastery of theology allowed her to position herself as the supreme governor of the Church of England, navigating between Catholic and Protestant factions with skill. Her ability to deliver theological arguments in Latin during her reign astonished contemporaries, a testament to the power of knowledge once considered forbidden. Yet the risks never abated. Catherine de' Medici's daughters, married into dynasties across Europe, were scrutinized for their religious affiliations during the wars of religion, and any hint of heresy in their education could be magnified into dynastic crises. The material evidence of these theological dangers can be seen in the censorship and confiscation of books. The Index of Prohibited Books, formalized by the Catholic Church in 1559 but anticipated by earlier local bans, targeted not only reformist works but also commentaries and translations deemed subversive. For princesses, whose libraries were curated as symbols of dynastic identity, the presence of suspect volumes was a political liability. Yet some inventories of royal libraries reveal titles by Erasmus, Luther, and Calvin, often annotated or disguised, suggesting that these texts circulated even in the most scrutinized environments. A princess who reads such works might gain intellectual tools to influence policy or marriage negotiations, but if discovered, she risked accusations of heresy that could destroy her reputation and destabilize her dynasty. Thus, theology was the most double-edged of all forms of learning for royal daughters. Indispensable for their public role as models of devotion, yet dangerous when pursued beyond surface piety. Their study of scripture and doctrine could elevate their prestige, prepare them for regency, or enable them to shape confessional identities. But it could also ignite suspicion, provoke clerical opposition, and entangle them in the fires of heresy trials or religious wars. In this way, the education of princesses in theology encapsulates the paradox of female learning in the medieval and early modern worlds, simultaneously demanded and feared, encouraged and suppressed, celebrated and condemned. The silent curriculum insisted on prayer, but the reality of history shows that when theology became more than ritual, when it became thought, it was fire, capable of illuminating or destroying, depending on who held the book and who watched them turn the page. In the medieval and early Renaissance courts of Europe, language was more than a means of communication. It was a marker of power, a gateway to knowledge, and, for royal daughters, one of the few intellectual tools that could expand their world beyond embroidery and prayer. For mastery of Latin, Greek, or even Arabic meant access to philosophy, science, law, and theology, disciplines that were otherwise barred to them. And yet this access was uneven, contested, and often fraught with danger, since the very act of learning a language could alter a princess's political value and raise suspicions about her ambitions. Latin, above all, was the essential language of scholarship, liturgy, and diplomacy, and while it was the standard curriculum for princes destined for universities or clerical office, it was rarely offered to their sisters, who were expected to remain within the vernacular. Yet some mothers, tutors, and courts recognized that Latin could be wielded as a weapon of prestige in marriage negotiations, and so, in carefully controlled circumstances, select princesses were trained in it. The Byzantine princess, Anna Komnene, in the 12th century, represents an early example of linguistic cultivation. While the Byzantine Empire had Greek as its intellectual lingua franca, her training in classical texts allowed her to engage directly with Plato, Aristotle, and Galen, enabling her to compose the a work that stands as one of the most remarkable products of female learning in the medieval world. In Western Europe, similar examples arose sporadically. Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughters were immersed in the French vernacular and exposed to courtly literature. But in later centuries, figures such as Catherine of Aragon, raised under the guidance of Isabella of Castile, received instruction in Latin, which allowed her to read scripture and converse with theologians when she arrived in England. Catherine's daughter, Mary Tudor, inherited this training and expanded it further, studying not only Latin but also Greek, enabling her to read early Christian writings in their original form, a rare skill for a woman in 16th century Europe. Language acquisition was not confined to Latin, as the horizons of European courts widened through trade, crusades, and diplomacy. Knowledge of other tongues became both practical and symbolic. In Iberia, the coexistence of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures produced an environment where Arabic and Hebrew manuscripts circulated, especially in cities like Toledo, where translation schools flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries. While there is little evidence that princesses were directly taught Arabic or Hebrew, the translations of Avicenna, Averroes, and Maimonides reached courts through intermediaries, and a princess with even rudimentary Latin could encounter fragments of this knowledge in her studies. Multilingual ability was also a diplomatic asset. Princesses destined for foreign marriages often studied the vernacular of their future courts, sometimes under intense pressure to adapt quickly. Margaret Tudor, married to James IV of Scotland, was expected to navigate Scots dialects. Anne of Bohemia, married to Richard II of England in 1382, had to master English customs and language, though her Bohemian retinue initially struggled in London. The acquisition of a new tongue symbolized the crossing of borders, the surrender of natal identity, and the forging of alliances. But it also granted these women the ability to mediate between cultures, sometimes wielding influence precisely because of their linguistic dexterity. The intellectual significance of language study was immense. Latin opened the door to logic, the discipline that underpinned scholasticism, where Aristotelian reasoning shaped university curricula in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. Princesses who learned Latin, even at a basic level, could absorb works such as Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy or Cicero's moral treatises. And though these might be framed as devotional aids, their content introduced modes of reasoning that extended beyond prayer. Elizabeth I of England provides the most striking example from the later Renaissance, trained in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. She astonished contemporaries by delivering speeches in Latin to university scholars and corresponding fluently with foreign rulers. Her command of languages serving as both a symbol of her authority and a practical tool of governance. But even before Elizabeth, women like Margaret of York in Burgundy, who commissioned manuscripts in French and Flemish, or Isabella d'Este in Mantua, who corresponded with Italian humanists in Latin, demonstrated that languages provided access to networks of power and culture that extended far beyond the silent curriculum. The teaching of languages to princesses was not without opposition. Clerics frequently warned against exposing women to Latin, arguing that it encouraged vanity or heresy. The association of Latin literacy with Lollardy in England and with reformist currents in Germany and Bohemia meant that female readers of scripture risked suspicion. The Council of Toulouse in 1229 explicitly forbade lay people from owning vernacular translations of the Bible, and while this ban targeted heretical groups, its enforcement often fell heavily on women, whose reading was considered particularly suspect. Yet paradoxically, queens and princesses were often praised for their ability to recite scripture in Latin, especially in ceremonial settings, suggesting that the boundary lay not in the knowledge itself, but in how it was used. A princess who recited the Psalms in Latin reinforced dynastic piety. A princess who debated theology in Latin threatened clerical control. Thus, language was a double-edged sword, a key to devotion when wielded passively, a weapon of defiance when used actively. The physical realities of language learning were similar to those of other hidden studies. Grammar, books, glossaries, and psalters with interlinear translations survive in manuscripts owned by noble households, some bearing annotations in female hands. Tutors often disguised language instruction as devotional training, introducing Latin prayers while quietly teaching grammar and syntax. Greek and Hebrew were rarer, but by the 15th century, humanist circles began advocating their inclusion in female education. The Italian noblewoman Cassandra Fedel, though not a princess, delivered Latin orations in Venice and corresponded with queens and noblewomen, her example influencing arguments that women, too, could master classical languages. This humanist defense gradually reached royal households. where ambitious mothers saw the political value of daughters who could command languages as well as sons. Language also intersected with the politics of marriage and diplomacy. A princess who could write in multiple tongues could correspond directly with her natal family, maintaining influence across borders. Queens consort who mastered the languages of their adopted realms gained loyalty and respect from their subjects, while those who failed to do so risked alienation. Catherine of Aragon's fluent Latin correspondence with Erasmus and Thomas More enhanced her reputation in England as a patron of learning, while Anne of Cleves's limited English proficiency contributed to her difficulties in Henry VIII's court. In this way, language ability shaped not only private study but public perception, influencing how princesses were judged as consorts, regents, or cultural patrons. Ultimately, Latin, logic, and languages constituted the keys to a wider world for royal daughters, allowing them to step beyond the confines of the silent curriculum into realms of thought, politics, and culture that were otherwise inaccessible. Their acquisition of these skills was never neutral. It could elevate a dynasty, enrich a court, or provoke suspicion and backlash. Some, like Elizabeth I, wielded languages as instruments of sovereignty. Others, like Catherine of Aragon and Mary Tudor, used them to defend faith and legitimacy. Many more remain unnamed in chronicles, their linguistic skills visible only in marginal notes or the survival of manuscripts in family libraries. But together, they reveal that the struggle for knowledge among royal daughters was fought not only in secret chambers with hidden books, but also in the very words they learnt to read, write, and speak, words that opened the world and, in doing so, threatened to change it. In the courts, convents, and castles of medieval and Renaissance Europe, where male tutors and clerical authorities closely guarded access to knowledge, one of the least visible but most enduring channels of education for princesses was the informal, often forbidden networks of women themselves. For while chronicles and state records rarely mention these relationships, the survival of letters, manuscripts, and anecdotes reveals that queens, ladies in waiting, noble companions, and even servants often acted as teachers, collaborators, and transmitters of learning, forming bonds that quietly challenged the rigid structures of the silent curriculum. These friendships provided not only emotional support in lives marked by dynastic obligation, but also intellectual companionship, creating webs of female exchange that passed books hand to hand, translated ideas into accessible forms, and fostered private discussions in embroidery chambers and cloisters, spaces overlooked by official chroniclers yet central to women's intellectual history. The model for such exchanges was not invented in the Middle Ages. For in antiquity and late antiquity, women had shared learning within aristocratic households and convents. But in the medieval context, where female literacy was often limited to devotion, these friendships became vital for extending intellectual horizons. A princess confined by watchful chaplains or political advisors might find in her mother, sister, or lady in waiting a willing partner who explained a Latin phrase, lent a Romance manuscript, or recited passages from a theological debate. The bonds of trust were crucial. Discovery of unsanctioned reading could provoke scandal or even charges of heresy. And so these friendships operated in secrecy, their power lying precisely in their invisibility. Evidence of these networks survives in correspondence. The letters of Christine de Pizan in the early 15th century reveal her engagement with noble patrons, many of them women who commissioned her works and exchanged ideas about female virtue, education, and political agency. Christine's Book of the City of Ladies, while not addressed to a specific princess, circulated in courts and was read by noblewomen who then recommended it to their daughters and companions. In this sense, Christine functioned as both author and tutor within a network of women, her writings providing intellectual ammunition for debates about female capacity. Similarly, the correspondence of Margaret of York, Duchess of Burgundy, and her stepdaughter Mary of Burgundy demonstrates how mothers and daughters collaborated in commissioning devotional and historical manuscripts, selecting content that reinforced dynastic identity but also broadened cultural horizons. These acts of patronage were communal, involving discussions with female attendants and scribes, and they reveal how shared female interests shaped the libraries of royal households. Convents, too, were spaces where women taught each other, especially when royal daughters spent formative years behind cloister walls. Nuns responsible for training noble novices often passed on not only liturgical routines but also literacy in Latin, music, and sometimes even rudimentary science or medicine drawn from monastic texts. The example of Hildegard of Bingen, though exceptional, illustrates the potential of such environments. She corresponded with queens, princesses, and abbesses, her letters forming part of a female intellectual network that influenced laywomen as well as religious. In later centuries, convents in Spain, France, and the Low Countries became known for manuscript production. And while official chronicles emphasize their devotional role, the presence of secular literature in some convent libraries suggests that women shared more than was officially permitted. A princess raised in such a convent might encounter not only psalters but also chronicles, romances, or moral treatises, transmitted orally or through shared reading among peers. Friendships among sisters provided another channel of learning. The daughters of Isabella of Castile, Catherine, Juana, Maria, and Isabella were all educated in languages and theology, and their correspondence across European courts after their marriages demonstrates a shared intellectual foundation. Catherine of Aragon, for instance, exchanged letters with Juana of Castile that reveal awareness of theological debates and dynastic politics. These sisters, though separated by geography, continued to share ideas, reinforcing each other's identities as educated queens consort. Similarly, the daughters of Edward IV of England, raised in a household of Elizabeth Woodville, benefited from a shared environment where their collective literacy was nurtured. Even if their individual destinies diverged in marriage or cloister, the communal aspect of their upbringing allowed them to sustain friendships that carried intellectual exchange beyond their youth. Even relationships with ladies-in-waiting could serve as conduits of learning. These women, often drawn from noble families, brought with them knowledge of literature, music, or languages, which they shared informally with their mistresses. In some cases, ladies-in-waiting introduced princesses to romances or poetry circulating among the nobility, texts that might otherwise have been deemed inappropriate for royal daughters. The circulation of Arthurian romances, for example, owes much to female patronage and readership, and it is likely that many princesses first encountered such stories through recitations or borrowings, facilitated by companions rather than tutors. This female-mediated transmission reveals a hidden curriculum running parallel to the official one, sustained by trust, affection, and the shared experience of confinement within courtly roles. The political implications of these friendships were significant. Educated queens often use their influence to encourage the learning of younger women in their courts, creating intellectual circles that functioned as informal academies. Isabella d'Este in Mantua cultivated such a circle, where noblewomen discussed literature, art, and politics. And though not all participants were princesses, their exchanges included women of royal blood whose exposure to such discussions expanded their intellectual horizons. In France, Marguerite de Navarre's salon performed a similar role, blending literary creativity with theological debate, and her encouragement of female writers and thinkers established a precedent for later generations. These networks blurred the boundary between friendship and patronage, with queens acting simultaneously as companions and protectors of intellectual exchange. The risks, however, were ever present. Inquisitorial records occasionally mention groups of women accused of sharing heretical texts or participating in suspect discussions. Though these cases rarely involved princesses directly, they reflect the broader suspicion surrounding female intellectual networks. A princess discovered reading reformist theology in the company of companions risked charges, not only against herself, but against her entire household. Yet the persistence of these friendships suggests that women valued intellectual solidarity despite the dangers. Their networks operated quietly, often unacknowledged in official histories, but their influence can be traced in the unexpected erudition of certain royal daughters, whose education cannot be explained solely by formal tutoring. Ultimately, forbidden friendships among women provided an alternative educational infrastructure, one based on trust, oral transmission, and shared reading. In chambers filled with embroidery, music, and prayer, women whispered verses of poetry, translated lines of Latin, or recited tales of saints and heroes. These moments of exchange, though invisible to chroniclers, left a profound mark on the intellectual lives of princesses. Through their companions, mothers, sisters, and attendants, royal daughters learned not only how to read, but how to interpret, compare, and question. It was a form of education woven into the fabric of daily life, sustained by bonds of loyalty and affection that outlasted marriages, political shifts, and even dynastic collapse. By teaching each other, women carved out intellectual spaces where official curricula denied them, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost and transmitting it across generations in the most human of ways: friendship. For medieval and Renaissance princesses, the pursuit of knowledge beyond the sanctioned boundaries of prayer, devotion, and etiquette carried risks that extended far beyond personal reprimand. For in an age when literacy itself was tied to power and theology to heresy, the discovery of a royal daughter studying forbidden texts or engaging with unsanctioned tutors could ignite scandal, provoke clerical condemnation, and even destabilize dynastic politics. And though the chronicles often conceal or soften these stories, scattered evidence across Europe reveals the heavy price women paid for curiosity, ranging from confinement to accusations of heresy and, in the most severe cases, loss of reputation, exile, or political ruin. The danger stemmed not only from what was read, but also from what knowledge symbolized. To read Latin fluently was to encroach upon clerical authority. To debate theology was to challenge the church. To correspond independently was to step into the sphere of diplomacy, a domain reserved for men. A princess caught crossing these lines risked being labeled disobedient or subversive, and because her identity embodied dynastic honor, the consequences were magnified. Her personal choices interpreted as threats to the legitimacy of her family. The suspicion toward female, Learning was deeply rooted in cultural and clerical attitudes. Medieval clerics from Peter Lombard to Thomas Aquinas emphasized women's intellectual weakness and susceptibility to error, ideas that were later reinforced in the rhetoric of inquisitors. The association between female literacy and heresy grew stronger with the rise of movements such as the Cathars in southern France. During the 12th and 13th centuries, where women played prominent roles as spiritual leaders, prompting the Church to view educated women with heightened suspicion. The Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229, not only crushed Catharism, but also reinforced the belief that female access to theology was dangerous. For princesses, whose education was more visible than that of ordinary women, any association with heterodox ideas risked drawing suspicion upon entire dynasties. The Council of Toulouse, in 1229, which prohibited lay possession of vernacular Bibles, made explicit the fear that unsanctioned reading would spread heresy. While the decree was general, its enforcement fell heavily on noble households, where literacy was more common, and female readers were among the first to be scrutinized. Confinement was one of the most common punishments for overstepping educational boundaries. Noble women accused of inappropriate reading or intellectual independence were sometimes placed in convents against their will, a measure that both silenced them and preserved dynastic honor. Cases of forced enclosure appear in legal and ecclesiastical records, though names are often obscured. For royal daughters, confinement functioned as both punishment and preventive measure. A princess showing signs of intellectual independence could be withdrawn from court and placed under the supervision of abbesses who enforced strict devotional routines. While such measures were rarely described explicitly as punishment, the effect was the same: removal from influence, isolation from political networks, and denial of intellectual companionship. Reputation, however, was the most fragile and devastating casualty. In courts where chroniclers shaped public memory, accusations of female intellectual pride could tarnish a princess's image for generations. The portrayal of Margaret of Anjou in English propaganda during the Wars of the Roses demonstrates how quickly a queen's political intelligence could be recast as arrogance or witchcraft, even though her education had prepared her for regency during her husband's incapacity. Similarly, Juana of Castile, though not guilty of heresy, was branded Juana la Loca, in part because her education and independence of spirit made her difficult to control. Her reputation was weaponized against her, and she was confined for decades, her intellect erased from public life under the guise of madness. These examples illustrate that the peril of knowledge often lay less in official charges than in the ease with which political enemies could manipulate female education into narratives of disorder, heresy, or instability. The Inquisition intensified the risks in the later Middle Ages and Renaissance. Women associated with reformist or mystical texts faced interrogation. And while most records focus on commoners or nuns, noble women occasionally appeared. Inquisitorial manuals, like the Malleus Maleficarum 1487, explicitly linked women's supposed intellectual curiosity to witchcraft, framing learning as a pathway to rebellion against God. Although few princesses were formally tried, the climate of fear created by inquisitorial campaigns ensured that their reading was closely monitored. In Spain, the daughters of Isabella of Castile lived under the shadow of the Spanish Inquisition, their libraries curated to exclude suspect works, and their confessional networks scrutinized for traces of heterodoxy. Yet even within this environment, Catherine of Aragon's exposure to Erasmus and humanist theology reveals the persistent tension between sanctioned learning and its dangers. Punishment could also take the form of political marginalization. A princess whose intellectual pursuits clashed with her husband's court might find herself sidelined or accused of meddling. Catherine de' Medici's reputation as a manipulative queen mother owes much to her reliance on astrology and her association with scholars viewed as suspect by Catholic hardliners. While she avoided formal charges, her intellectual interests were weaponized in pamphlets that painted her as sinister. Elizabeth I of England, though admired for her learning, was likewise targeted by Catholic propaganda that portrayed her erudition as arrogance and her theology as heresy, illustrating how easily education could be reframed as vice. The price of knowledge was also borne in private suffering. For many princesses, the fear of discovery created an atmosphere of silence and caution, curbing intellectual ambition. Manuscripts with erased annotations, palimpsests overwritten with devotional texts, and fragmentary letters suggest that women destroyed evidence of their learning to protect themselves. The loss to history is immeasurable. Countless voices silenced, countless ideas suppressed, countless potential authorships erased by fear. What survives are traces, a marginal note, a line of translation, a rumor in a chronicle, enough to suggest what was risked, but not enough to recover what was lost. Yet despite these perils, some women persisted, their punishments transforming into legacies. An Askew in 16th century England, though not a princess, was burned at the stake for her Protestant beliefs, and her case reverberated in courtly circles, warning noblewomen of the risks of theological engagement. Her fate underscored the stakes for royal daughters, whose higher visibility made their intellectual independence even more dangerous. And yet, paradoxically, it also demonstrated the power of female conviction, inspiring later generations to view knowledge not only as peril but as principle worth suffering for. In the end, the punishments faced by princesses who pursued forbidden learning revealed the deep anxieties of their societies. Knowledge was power, and when women approached it, they threatened the structures that upheld dynastic and clerical control. The perils they endured, confinement, loss of reputation, accusations of heresy, political marginalization, and even madness, were the costs of stepping beyond the silent curriculum. Their stories remind us that education was not merely personal growth, but political rebellion, an act fraught with consequences that could reshape lives and legacies. For royal daughters, the price of knowledge was never abstract. It was written in their fates, carved into the chronicles of courts that alternately silenced and celebrated them, a testament to the dangerous allure of learning in an age when even turning a page could be seen as treason. By the dawn of the Renaissance in the 14th and 15th centuries, the intellectual climate of Europe began to shift in ways that profoundly altered the education of royal daughters. For the revival of classical learning, the circulation of humanist ideals, and the slow but revolutionary spread of the printing press created new opportunities for women to access knowledge and for ambitious families to use that learning as a tool of prestige, even as suspicion and resistance remained. This was the age when the silent curriculum of obedience and devotion began to crack open, allowing light from the wider world to filter into the lives of princesses, reshaping their roles as consorts, patrons, and even rulers. The Italian city-states were the earliest laboratories of this transformation, where courts such as Florence, Ferrara, and Mantua embraced the humanist movement with its emphasis on grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy, subjects drawn from antiquity that had long been reserved for men. In these courts, noble and royal women were increasingly drawn into circles of learning, not only as patrons but as participants. The famous educator Vittorino da Feltre, who established a school in Mantua in the early 15th century, is recorded as teaching both boys and girls from the Gonzaga family, an exceptional practice at the time that reflected the growing recognition of the political value of educated daughters. Similarly, Guarino da Verona and other humanists trained the daughters of elite families in Latin and literature, equipping them with skills that enhanced their dynastic appeal. This trend did not eliminate traditional gendered expectations, but it subtly redefined them. A princess might still be expected to embody piety and obedience, but now she could also display eloquence, wit, and literary knowledge as part of her public identity. The Renaissance ideal of the donna, the cultivated woman, found one of its clearest expressions in Isabella d'Este, the Marchioness of Mantua, whose extensive education in Latin, Greek, music, and the arts enabled her to preside over one of the most brilliant courts of the early 16th century. While Isabella was technically not a princess by birth, but a noblewoman of Ferrara, her marriage into Mantua placed her in royal company, and her cultural authority influenced countless princesses across Europe who looked to her as a model. Her sister Beatrice d'Este, married into Milan, shared similar training and likewise became a patron of humanist scholars and artists. These examples illustrate how Renaissance education for women, once restricted to isolated convents or informal tutoring, now entered the public arena of courtly display, with queens and princesses commissioning libraries, sponsoring translations, and participating in intellectual correspondence. In Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici's daughters received advanced educations that reflected the city's central role in humanist culture, and through strategic marriages, they carried this learning into other courts, spreading Renaissance ideals beyond Italy, outside Italy. The influence of humanism spread northward, gradually reshaping royal education in France, Spain, England, and the Low Countries. In Spain, Isabella of Castile exemplified the fusion of dynastic ambition and humanist education. Unlike many of her predecessors, Isabella received training in Latin and theology that prepared her for governance, and she ensured that her daughters were educated in languages, history, and philosophy. Catherine of Aragon's erudition, which astonished the English when she arrived to marry Prince Arthur and later Henry VIII, was the direct result of Isabella's investment in female learning. Juana of Castile, though remembered for her tragic confinement, likewise possessed a strong education that enabled her to govern, briefly before political circumstances stripped her of authority. These daughters carried humanist ideals into marriages with Habsburg, English, and Portuguese royalty, spreading Renaissance education across Europe through dynastic ties. In France, Marguerite de Navarre, sister of King Francis I, epitomized the possibilities of the Renaissance for royal women. Her court became a center of literary and theological debate, and she herself authored works such as the Heptameron, blending storytelling with moral and spiritual reflection. Marguerite's patronage of humanists and reformers placed her at the heart of the intellectual currents of her time, and her example demonstrated that a royal woman could be both a cultural leader and an author in her own right. Her niece, Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, would later take this inheritance further, embracing Calvinism and playing a central role in the French wars of religion. In the Burgundian Netherlands, Mary of Hungary, sister of Emperor Charles V, was educated in the humanist tradition and became a capable regent who presided over a flourishing court of music, literature, and art. These women illustrate how Renaissance education once controversial, became a vital instrument of dynastic strength, enabling princesses and queens to wield influence, not merely as passive consorts, but as active agents of culture and politics. The invention of the printing press by Gutenberg around 1450 accelerated these changes, making books more affordable and accessible, and expanding the range of texts that could reach royal households, where earlier princesses relied on rare manuscripts smuggled or copied by hand. Renaissance princesses increasingly had access to printed editions of classical works, devotional manuals, and humanist treatises. Libraries of royal women expanded accordingly. Inventories of Margaret of Austria's collection reveal volumes in Latin, French, and Spanish, including works of history and philosophy. Margaret, who served as regent of the Netherlands in the early 16th century, was one of the most educated women of her generation, her library a symbol of her intellectual and political authority. Similarly, Anne of Brittany, twice Queen of France, maintained a library of illuminated manuscripts and printed books that reflected both devotion and humanist curiosity. The printing press thus democratized learning within elite circles, reducing the logistical barriers that had once made hidden studies so difficult. Yet it also heightened clerical fears, as books could now spread reformist theology with alarming speed, placing royal women once again in the crosshairs of censorship on England. The Renaissance transformation became most visible in the education of Elizabeth I. Though her path was shaped by the Reformation, Elizabeth's humanist training under tutors such as Roger Ascham reflected the broader Renaissance emphasis on classical languages and literature. Fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, Elizabeth became the most linguistically skilled monarch of her era. Her education not only a personal triumph, but a political weapon. Her ability to address scholars in Latin or compose poetry in Italian astonished ambassadors and reinforced her authority as a sovereign. Elizabeth's erudition was the culmination of generations of gradual expansion in female education, a legacy stretching back through Catherine of Aragon, Isabella of Castile, and the courts of Renaissance Italy. Still, the opening of educational doors did not eliminate risks. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation politicized learning in ways that threatened royal women as much as it empowered them. Marguerite de Navarre's support of reformist thinkers brought her under suspicion from conservative clerics, and Catherine of Aragon's reliance on humanist theologians such as Erasmus was later used against her in Henry VIII's campaign for annulment. The Council of Trent in the mid-16th century reasserted strict limits on women's theological engagement, reminding Europe that the Renaissance opening was never absolute. For princesses, learning remained both a privilege and a liability, celebrated when it reinforced dynastic authority, condemned when it seemed to challenge clerical or patriarchal control. The Renaissance, therefore, represented a paradox for royal daughters. On the one hand, it opened doors through humanism, printing, and patronage, allowing women to step into roles as authors, patrons, and political actors. On the other, it intensified scrutiny, as educated women became lightning rods for religious and political controversy. Yet the transformation was undeniable. Where earlier princesses had studied in secrecy, hiding manuscripts in embroidery chests, Renaissance princesses increasingly displayed their learning in public, commissioning libraries, composing works, and corresponding with scholars across Europe. The silent curriculum had not disappeared, but it was now overshadowed by a parallel curriculum of humanism, which redefined what it meant to be a cultivated princess. In their libraries, their letters, and their courts. These women carried the Renaissance into dynastic politics, ensuring that the door once cracked open would never fully close again. The legacy of forbidden and hidden learning among royal daughters was not confined to private chambers or whispered friendships. In many cases, it reshaped dynasties, altered succession crises, redirected alliances, and even shifted the religious and cultural trajectories of entire kingdoms, for the ideas absorbed by princesses in their youth, sometimes through secret tutors or maternal encouragement, did not remain contained within their own lives, but rippled outward through the marriages they entered, the children they raised, and the regencies they held. Across Europe from the late Middle Ages into the Renaissance, dynastic history repeatedly demonstrates how books, the works of scripture, philosophy, theology, or classical literature, once placed into the hands of royal daughters, could have consequences far beyond the intentions of those who permitted or forbade them. In Spain, Isabella of Castile stands as one of the clearest examples, though not a princess by the time her education was completed. Her training in Latin, theology, and humanist thought directly influenced the education she arranged for her daughters, who carried Spain's intellectual and religious agenda into England, Portugal, and the Habsburg Netherlands. Catherine of Aragon, through her humanist learning, became both a patron of Erasmus and an intellectual force in England, shaping the early Tudor court into a space where reformist and humanist debates flourished. The eventual break between Henry VIII and Rome cannot be understood apart from Catherine's education. For her ability to argue her case for the validity of her marriage in Latin before theologians and canon lawyers prolonged the crisis and forced Henry into more radical actions. In this sense, Catherine's education, inherited from her mother, played an indirect but decisive role in the English Reformation, a transformation that altered the religious identity of an entire nation. Dynastic consequences also appear in the case of Juana of Castile, Isabella's daughter, whose education in languages and theology initially prepared her for her role as consort of Philip the Handsome and later mother of Charles V, ruler of the vast Habsburg Empire. Though Juana's mental health and political isolation are often emphasized, her early learning positioned her as a capable regent during moments of crisis, and her education, transmitted to her son, ensured that the Habsburg dynasty inherited not only Iberian territories, but also the intellectual legacy of humanism. Charles V's multilingualism and theological sophistication can be traced in part to his mother's training, reminding us that the hidden learning of a princess could echo through the reign of an emperor. Similarly, Margaret of Austria, Juana's sister and another granddaughter of Isabella, was raised with a strong humanist education that equipped her to govern the Netherlands as regent with extraordinary skill. Her library of over 300 volumes, many in Latin and French, became a center of intellectual life, and her patronage of Erasmus and other scholars directly influenced the cultural flourishing of the Low Countries. In these cases, the education of royal daughters transmitted through dynasties shaped not only immediate alliances, but also the intellectual and religious orientation of empires in England. Dynastic transformation through books is perhaps most dramatically embodied in Elizabeth I, her training in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, her study of scripture and classical philosophy, and her constant engagement with literature made her one of the most learned monarchs of her age, and her education was the product of deliberate investment by tutors who believed that her learning would strengthen the dynasty. Elizabeth's refusal to marry transformed her erudition into a symbol of sovereignty, and her ability to address ambassadors and scholars in their own languages reinforced England's prestige. But more importantly, her theological and historical knowledge enabled her to navigate the confessional divides of her kingdom, maintaining a delicate balance between Protestant and Catholic factions that preserved relative stability in a time of violent religious wars elsewhere in Europe. The survival of the Tudor dynasty through Elizabeth's reign was inseparable from her education, demonstrating how a princess's books could preserve not only her own authority but the continuity of her line. Other dynasties reveal similar patterns. In France, Marguerite de Navarre's literary and theological works influenced her daughter Jeanne d'Albret, whose conversion to Calvinism positioned Navarre at the forefront of the Huguenot cause. Jeanne's son, Henry of Navarre, later Henry IV of France, was shaped by his mother's religious convictions, and when he ascended to the French throne, his pragmatic conversion to Catholicism and subsequent Edict of Nantes reflected a negotiation between the Protestant legacy of his upbringing and the Catholic reality of his kingdom. Here, too, the education of a royal daughter, Marguerite's encouragement of theological debate, and Jeanne's embrace of Protestant texts left an indelible mark on French dynastic history in the Burgundian Netherlands. Mary of Burgundy inherited not only vast territories but also a cultural and intellectual identity forged through the manuscript traditions of her court. Her patronage of books and her exposure to history and philosophy shaped her approach to governance during her brief reign. After her death, her children, raised in the Habsburg tradition, continued to emphasize humanist education, ensuring that dynastic authority in the Low Countries was closely tied to intellectual culture. The consequences of this legacy reached into the reign of her grandson Charles V and beyond, influencing the cultural and political character of one of Europe's most contested regions. The dangers of books altering dynasties also appear in more tragic forms. In England, Lady Jane Grey, though not a reigning princess but of royal blood, exemplifies how education could destabilize succession. Trained in Latin and Greek by humanist tutors, Jane became one of the most learned women of her time. But her erudition also made her a pawn in the hands of Protestant factions who sought to place her on the throne in 1553. Her education, which had once been praised as exemplary, was reinterpreted as dangerous when she became the figurehead of a political coup. And her execution at age 16 stands as a reminder that books could bring not only prestige but peril, their influence capable of igniting dynastic crisis. The circulation of books also changed dynasties by shaping the education of heirs. Queens consort and regents often acted as the transmitters of knowledge, selecting tutors and libraries for their children. Blanche of Castile ensured the education of her son Louis IX, whose reputation for piety and justice became foundational to Capetian prestige. Catherine of Aragon supervised the education of Mary Tudor, embedding humanist theology into the Tudor dynasty. Margaret of Austria oversaw the upbringing of her Habsburg nieces and nephews, instilling in them the multilingual humanist culture that would characterize the dynasty for generations. These cases demonstrate that the intellectual formation of dynasties was not only a male inheritance, but was profoundly shaped by the learning of royal daughters, who transmitted books, values, and methods of reasoning to future rulers. The unexpected legacy of books in the hands of princesses lies in their capacity to alter history in ways that contemporaries did not anticipate. When a princess read Cicero or Augustine, Erasmus or Calvin, it was not merely personal enrichment but the planting of seeds that might bear fruit decades later in the policies of kings. the alliances of dynasties, or the survival of empires. The chroniclers rarely acknowledged this influence directly, preferring to credit male rulers with intellectual achievements. Yet, the evidence of correspondence, libraries, and patronage reveals that dynasties were changed by the hidden curriculum of their daughters. From Isabella of Castile to Elizabeth I, from Marguerite de Navarre to Margaret of Austria, the thread is clear. Forbidden or unconventional learning among royal women was not a marginal curiosity but a force that shaped the destinies of kingdoms. Books, once smuggled into chambers or disguised beneath embroidery, became dynastic weapons, their legacy written not only in illuminated pages but in treaties, decrees, and the survival of lines that defined Europe's history. Among the most fascinating legacies of education among medieval and Renaissance princesses was the way it intersected with love, letters, and literature. For while dynastic marriages were arranged primarily for political gain, the cultivation of literacy and familiarity with poetry, romances, and classical texts enabled royal daughters to engage with their husbands, families, and wider courts in ways that carried emotional, cultural, and political weight. The letters they composed, the poems they read, and the romances they exchanged not only reveal the private world of their affections and anxieties, but also demonstrate how literacy transformed them into participants in the literary culture of their age, sometimes subtly shaping politics through the language of love. From the 12th century onward, when the courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine in Poitiers and Bordeaux became centers of troubadour poetry, aristocratic women were increasingly associated with the ideals of courtly love. Although troubadour verse was often performed orally, its circulation in manuscript form meant that literate women, including princesses, encountered the language of romantic devotion in written form. Eleanor's daughter, Marie of Champagne, patronized Chrétien de Troyes, whose Arthurian romances such as Lancelot, The Knight of the Cart blended chivalric adventure with explorations of love, fidelity, and betrayal. These texts, often copied in lavish manuscripts, circulated among noble women and influenced their perception of marriage, fidelity, and power, while the marriages of princesses were political arrangements. The language of romance gave them a cultural script through which to express or negotiate their roles, and their patronage of such literature demonstrates how learning in the form of literacy intersected with the culture of love. Letters were perhaps the most direct intersection of literacy and love for royal daughters. The correspondence of medieval queens and princesses survives in fragmentary form, but where it does, it reveals a sophisticated use of language to maintain ties across marriages and political borders. Elizabeth of York, Queen Consort of Henry VII of England, wrote letters that reflect not only her role as a mother and wife, but also her careful negotiation of political language, balancing affection with dynastic duty. Margaret of Austria, Regent of the Netherlands, left behind a significant body of correspondence in French and Latin, demonstrating her command of rhetoric and her ability to use letters both to express personal loyalty and to manage complex political relationships. Catherine of Aragon's letters to her father Ferdinand of Aragon and later to her nephew Charles reveal her reliance on learned expression to sustain familial ties and defend her position. During her troubled marriage to Henry VIII, these letters, infused with theological references and classical allusions, show how education transformed a queen into an articulate defender of her own legitimacy. The private world of love and affection was thus inseparable from the public world of politics, for in the life of a princess, a letter could function simultaneously as an intimate gesture and a diplomatic act. Poetry likewise became an arena where educated princesses participated in the culture of love. Marguerite de Navarre, sister of Francis I of France, not only patronized poets but composed her own verses, blending themes of romance, spirituality, and personal reflection. Her Heptameron, modeled on Boccaccio's Decameron, used the framework of storytelling to explore moral and emotional dilemmas, offering a unique window into the intersection of female authorship and the language of love. Elizabeth I of England, though famously cautious in her presentation of romance, composed poems and translated works that revealed her mastery of literary language, using the rhetoric of affection strategically in her dealings with courtiers and foreign suitors. Literature gave princesses a means to navigate the contradictions of their position, desired as brides but constrained by politics, allowing them to engage with ideas of fidelity, passion, and agency even when their marriages were arranged without their consent. The patronage of romances and literature by royal women also had wider cultural consequences. Queens such as Anne of Brittany commissioned illuminated manuscripts that included not only devotional texts but also romances and histories, ensuring that the culture of chivalric love remained intertwined with dynastic identity. Mary of Burgundy, whose marriage to Maximilian of Habsburg united to powerful dynasties, was celebrated in Burgundian courtly literature as an embodiment of fidelity and virtue. Her personal image cultivated through both visual art and written texts. These examples reveal how literature functioned as propaganda as much as entertainment, with princesses both consuming and embodying the ideals expressed in romances and poetry. The dangers of love and literature, however, were also real. Letters could be intercepted, poems could be circulated beyond their intended audience, and romances could inspire suspicions of impropriety. The association of Anne Boleyn with reformist literature, combined with her private correspondence with Henry VIII, contributed to the construction of her image as a seductress and conspirator, ultimately leading to her downfall. Similarly, Lady Jane Grey's erudition and her alignment with Protestant writings were recast by her enemies as dangerous ambition. These cases remind us that while love, letters, and literature offered princesses a means of expression, they also exposed them to peril when their words were politicized. Yet, despite the risks, the literary engagement of princesses left a lasting legacy. Their letters preserved in archives, their patronage of poets, and their own compositions demonstrate that they were not passive figures in the culture of love, but active participants who shaped the literary traditions of their time. Through their writings and their support of authors, they helped transmit romances, poems, and theological debates across courts and dynasties, ensuring that the language of love was not confined to men. Their participation reminds us that the education of royal daughters, once restricted to prayer and embroidery, expanded into realms of literature that influenced not only their personal lives, but the cultural fabric of Europe. Love and learning were intertwined, and for princesses, the ability to write a letter or commission a poem was both an act of affection and a demonstration of intellect, revealing the profound ways in which literacy reshaped the private and public dimensions of their lives. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, convents stood as paradoxical spaces in the lives of royal daughters. On the surface, they were sanctuaries of devotion, silence, and obedience, places where dynasties could send unwanted or politically inconvenient daughters to live out lives in prayer. But beneath that surface, they were also centers of literacy, manuscript culture, and occasionally intellectual resistance. Environments where women could encounter texts, ideas, and authority otherwise denied them in the courts of men, and for many princesses. Time spent in a convent, whether temporary during childhood education or permanent through vows, left profound marks on their intellectual lives. The history of women's learning cannot be told without recognizing the role of monastic institutions. For these houses preserved libraries, taught literacy, and allowed women to participate, albeit cautiously, in traditions of study that predated the universities. Royal and noble families across Europe frequently placed daughters in convents, sometimes as a form of pious offering, sometimes to reduce dowry burdens, and sometimes as a political maneuver to remove them from contention in dynastic disputes. While not all convents encouraged advanced learning, many did provide training in reading, writing, music, and the copying of manuscripts, creating opportunities for princesses to cultivate intellectual skills under the cover of devotion. Evidence of princesses in convent education appears from the early Middle Ages in Anglo-Saxon England. Royal women such as Hilda of Whitby presided over double monasteries where men and women studied scripture together. And though later reforms restricted such mixed environments, the precedent of learned abbesses endured. In the Carolingian period, Charlemagne's daughters were educated within convent-like households, trained in reading and singing psalms, though the emperor famously refused to marry them, preferring to keep them within his court. By the High Middle Ages, convents such as those of the Benedictines and later the Cistercians provided structured environments where literacy could be taught. The daughters of noble and royal families often received their first training in these houses, learning to read Latin prayers and to copy letters. The discipline of monastic life, hours marked by bells, days filled with psalms, fasting, and manual labor, reinforced the virtues of silence and obedience expected of women. But within the rhythm of devotion, space existed for intellectual engagement. Libraries in major convents, particularly in Germany, France, and the Low Countries, contained not only scripture but also works of classical philosophy, natural science, and medical texts, and while access was restricted, women occasionally gained exposure through the process of copying or illumination. Some princesses made convents their lifelong homes and emerged as influential figures of learning and resistance. In the 12th century, Hildegard of Bingen, though not royal, demonstrated what was possible within a monastic framework. She composed theological treatises, music, and natural science works, corresponded with popes and emperors, and left behind writings that challenged traditional notions of female silence. While her case was extraordinary, it illustrates the intellectual potential of monastic women in an era that denied them universities. Royal daughters who became abbesses sometimes wielded similar authority. In the Ottonian and Salian dynasties of the Holy Roman Empire, princesses placed as abbesses of Quedlinburg or Gandersheim presided over wealthy convents, managing estates, overseeing libraries, and in some cases commissioning chronicles and histories. These abbesses were both political and intellectual figures, their authority grounded in their ability to maintain piety while cultivating learning. Yet convents could also serve as prisons. Royal daughters whose marriages failed, whose families sought to disinherit them, or whose behavior attracted scandal were often confined in cloisters, cut off from worldly influence. In these cases, intellectual life could become a form of resistance. Juana of Castile, though never formally a nun, spent decades of her life confined in convents under guard, her reputation maligned as madness. Chronicles describe her attending Mass obsessively and being denied wider engagement. Yet fragments of her correspondence reveal a woman aware of her political situation and intellectually alert. Similarly, some noblewomen accused of heresy were sent into lifelong monastic confinement rather than executed. Their silence enforced, but their presence a reminder of the fear inspired by women who knew too much. The convent thus embodied both the opportunity for education and the peril of suppression. The Renaissance heightened these contradictions. As humanist ideals spread, some convents embraced the new learning, teaching Latin, rhetoric, and even Greek to women who sought to read scripture in its original languages. In Italy, convents in Florence, Ferrara, and Venice produced nuns skilled in music, poetry, and philosophy, some of whom corresponded with leading humanists. Princesses placed in these houses encountered curricula that rivaled those of universities, albeit framed in devotional terms. Isabella d'Este's daughter, Eleanor Gonzaga, spent time in a convent where she absorbed humanist culture before marrying into Urbino. Across Europe, royal daughters raised in cloisters sometimes emerged as surprisingly erudite consorts. Their learning shaped less by court tutors than by nuns. Yet suspicion lingered. The Catholic Church's anxieties about women's access to scripture intensified during the Reformation, and convents became sites of contestation. In Protestant regions, many houses were dissolved, depriving women of one of their few institutional avenues for education. In Catholic regions, reformed movements like the Council of Trent sought to enforce stricter enclosure, curbing correspondence and intellectual exchange. Still, resistance persisted. Letters from nuns in Spain and the Low Countries reveal frustration with confinement, and a desire for broader engagement with books and ideas. Some convents hid prohibited texts, circulating them secretly among sisters. Royal daughters, accustomed to greater liberty in courts, often struggled when forced into permanent enclosure, and their attempts to read, write, or correspond could be viewed as rebellion. Yet these efforts, though hidden, sustained a tradition of female learning that otherwise might have been extinguished. The convent, in this sense, was both a tomb and a school, a place where dynasties buried inconvenient daughters and where those daughters sometimes found ways to resist through books, letters, and ideas. The shadow of the convent on the education of royal daughters is thus twofold. It provided one of the few institutional structures where women could learn to read and write, preserving fragments of classical and theological culture. Yet it also functioned as a tool of dynastic control, silencing women who threatened patriarchal authority. Princesses who passed through convent walls carried its marks into their later lives, whether as obedient consorts shaped by devotional training or as regents and queens who drew on their cloistered learning to govern with unexpected authority. The convent was never neutral. It was a contested space where obedience met curiosity, where silence met song, and where royal daughters encountered both the possibilities and the perils of knowledge. If the Renaissance had briefly opened doors to wider learning for royal daughters, the counterforces of censorship in the late medieval and early modern world worked just as deliberately to close them. For as the printing press spread ideas at unprecedented speed and reformist currents shook the foundations of Christendom, kings, bishops, inquisitors, and councils moved to reassert control. ensuring that the fragile gains made by women in accessing knowledge were once again scrutinized, monitored, and sometimes erased. Censorship was not a single act, but a system, a network of surveillance extending from papal decrees and university statutes to household chaplains and royal librarians, all designed to ensure that books, letters, and ideas in the hands of women remained under watch. And for princesses whose reading carried dynastic weight, these restrictions were both stricter and more dangerous than ever. The late medieval church had already issued prohibitions, such as the Council of Toulouse in 1229, which forbade laypeople from possessing vernacular Bibles, a measure intended to crush heresy but which disproportionately affected literate women, whose reading was often in the vernacular rather than in Latin. By the 15th and 16th centuries, such prohibitions multiplied. The establishment of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum by Pope Paul IV in 1559 formalized centuries of ad hoc bans, listing texts by authors as varied as Erasmus, Luther, and Machiavelli, and although aimed at all readers, the index placed particular scrutiny on noble and royal households, where libraries became curated battlegrounds of orthodoxy and curiosity. For royal daughters, this climate meant that every book could be a potential liability. Inventories of libraries from France, Spain, and the Habsburg Netherlands reveal a pattern of careful curation. Devotional texts, saintly lives, and moral treatises dominated, while works of philosophy, reform, or humanist theology were either absent or disguised under general titles, such as miscellanea. Yet, the very need to disguise or exclude reveals the demand. Queens and princesses often petitioned for books, sometimes acquiring them through networks of scholars or merchants, and their acquisitions did not go unnoticed. The Spanish Inquisition monitored the libraries of noble households, and even Catherine of Aragon's possession of Erasmus's writings placed her under scrutiny when reformist controversies erupted in England. Marguerite de Navarre's literary output and her patronage of Protestant thinkers in France drew condemnation from the Sorbonne, which sought to suppress her works, though her royal status shielded her from direct punishment. Jeanne d'Albret, her daughter, faced far harsher consequences. Her open embrace of Calvinist writings led to political isolation and war. In each case, the reading habits of royal women were not private matters, but public acts with consequences for dynasties and kingdoms. Censorship also operated through education itself. Tutors were vetted for orthodoxy, chaplains monitored reading, and household officials reported suspicious behavior. In some courts, princesses' letters were intercepted or dictated, denying them independent written expression. The very act of writing in cipher or code, sometimes used by noblewomen to protect correspondence, could provoke accusations of conspiracy. Anne Boleyn's possession of reformist tracts, combined with her role in promoting English translations of the Bible, became evidence in her trial for treason and heresy, illustrating how female literacy could be criminalized when it intersected with political factionalism. Even Elizabeth I, whose learning was celebrated, had to navigate censorship carefully, banning books that challenged her authority while simultaneously cultivating her image as a learned monarch. Her reign shows the paradox of censorship. A woman educated in humanism could use knowledge as power, but she also wielded censorship as a weapon against her enemies, turning the very system that once constrained her into a tool of sovereignty. The mechanics of censorship were often material. Books deemed dangerous were confiscated, burned, or physically altered. Marginal notes were scraped away, heretical passages blotted out, and some manuscripts rebound with safer texts to disguise their content. For princesses, whose libraries symbolized dynastic prestige, such purges were both personal losses and political necessities. The destruction of female libraries in times of religious upheaval, as during the dissolution of monasteries in England or the wars of religion in France, erased countless traces of women's intellectual activity. What survives are fragments, letters referencing lost volumes, inventories listing confiscated titles, and occasional surviving books bearing signs of censorship. These remnants tell a story not of absence but of suppression, a deliberate effort to silence women's reading and to contain the threat posed by their knowledge. Despite these efforts, censorship was never absolute. The very energy devoted to monitoring female literacy suggests how persistent the desire for knowledge remained. Princesses and queens found ways to circumvent restrictions, commissioning manuscripts from sympathetic scribes, disguising secular texts as devotional ones, or exchanging books through trusted companions. Networks of women, described in earlier chapters, functioned as underground channels of circulation. Convents, despite stricter enclosure after the Council of Trent, sometimes smuggled books in and out, maintaining spaces of resistance. The repeated reissuance of censored lists across Europe demonstrates that forbidden reading was never eradicated but constantly resurfaced. The cost of censorship, however, was profound. Generations of royal daughters were denied access to the full breadth of learning that their brothers received, not because of lack of ability, but because of fear. Fear that a woman with books could become a political liability, a heretic, or a rival. The silencing of female voices in history owes much to this system, which erased writings, suppressed letters, and ensured that many intellectual contributions of women remain hidden. Yet paradoxically, censorship also highlighted the very power it sought to suppress. By placing books under watch, the Church and dynasties acknowledged their potential to shape minds and alter politics. In this sense, the act of censorship testifies to the influence of women's reading, a legacy preserved in the vigilance it provoked. For royal daughters, living under censorship meant walking a narrow path between obedience and curiosity. A princess who read only devotional texts embodied the silent curriculum. One who reached for Erasmus or Cicero risked suspicion. The eyes of confessors, tutors, and chroniclers followed them, ready to turn a page into evidence of rebellion. Yet their persistence in reading, writing, and commissioning works ensured that knowledge, though under watch, never disappeared entirely. The history of censorship in their lives is therefore not only a story of restriction, but also of resilience, of women who found ways to learn even when every book was treated as a potential crime. The struggle of medieval and Renaissance princesses to pursue knowledge, often in secrecy and against resistance, might easily have vanished into silence had it not been for the fragments of evidence that survive. The echoes of their voices preserved in manuscripts, letters, chronicles, inventories, and portraits, and yet piecing together their intellectual lives requires immense care. For the historical record is partial, biased, and frequently hostile to female agency. What we know of their hidden learning comes not from a steady stream of testimony, but from scattered traces the historians have painstakingly recovered, each fragment a reminder of how much has been lost and how deliberate erasure shaped the narrative of women's education. Surviving letters are among the most powerful sources. The correspondence of Catherine of Aragon with her father Ferdinand, her nephew Charles V, and scholars such as Erasmus shows not only her literacy but also her command of Latin and theological argument. and even in moments of personal crisis, such as Henry VIII's attempt to annul their marriage. Her letters reveal an educated woman deploying scripture and canon law with precision. Elizabeth I's speeches and private writings, including her translations of classical works, provide another direct echo, demonstrating the culmination of generations of humanist training. Marguerite de Navarre's Heptameron, though literary rather than purely personal, reflects her intellectual networks and her willingness to use narrative as a means of moral and theological exploration. These writings are rare, not because few women wrote, but because so many letters and texts were destroyed, censored, or simply dismissed as unworthy of preservation, leaving historians to reconstruct the scope of female learning through chance survivals. Libraries and inventories provide another crucial echo. Records of Margaret of Austria's vast collection, meticulously catalogued after her death, reveal hundreds of volumes in Latin, French, and Spanish, including works of philosophy, theology, and poetry, a clear testament to the intellectual environment she cultivated as regent of the Netherlands. The Library of Anne of Brittany, twice Queen of France, included richly illuminated manuscripts that combined devotion with humanist learning, showing how books functioned both as pious objects and as instruments of prestige. The survival of these inventories demonstrates not only the scale of women's collections, but also their role in shaping dynastic culture. For these books were not hidden curiosities, but central symbols of royal identity. Yet gaps remain. We know from chronicles that Juana of Castile possessed books and read in confinement, but few of her volumes survive, their destruction or dispersal leaving only silence where her intellectual voice once stood. Marginalia, the notes scribbled in the margins of manuscripts, provide some of the most intimate glimpses of princesses' engagement with texts. A psalter annotated by Anne of Bohemia includes corrections that suggest she was more than a passive reader. Manuscripts once owned by Mary Tudor bear marks of use that hint at study beyond liturgical routine. Even prayer books, when annotated, reveal patterns of thought that go beyond rote devotion, offering insight into how women interpreted texts within their own contexts. These marginal notes, often overlooked by their contemporaries, are now among the most valuable clues because they capture unguarded engagement with ideas. Evidence that women did not simply receive knowledge passively, but actively wrestled with it. Visual sources add another dimension. Portraits of princesses surrounded by books, though often symbolic, reinforce the association between female literacy and dynastic identity. The famous portrait of Elizabeth I holding a book projects her as a sovereign who embodies wisdom as well as authority. Earlier illuminations of Anne of Brittany or Mary of Burgundy depict them with open manuscripts, signaling their cultural refinement. While such imagery could be idealized propaganda, it nonetheless testifies to the expectation that educated women enhanced the prestige of their families. In tomb effigies, stained glass, and courtly art, books appear as attributes of queens and princesses, blending devotion with learning, suggesting that even when their intellectual authority was curtailed, their identity as readers was acknowledged publicly. Historians also rely on the voices of contemporaries, though these must be read critically. Chroniclers like Jean Froissart, Philippe de Comines, or Polydore, Virgil occasionally mention the learning of royal women, often praising it when it reinforced dynastic stability and condemning it when it seemed threatening. Anne Boleyn's learning was described by her enemies as arrogance, while Catherine of Aragon's was lauded as piety. Such accounts reveal as much about cultural anxieties as about the women themselves, reminding us that the record of female education is entangled with propaganda. Even hostile descriptions, however, preserve echoes of reality. If opponents accused a princess of meddling in theology, it is likely because she did in fact read or debate beyond expectation. In this way, criticism becomes indirect evidence of learning. Archaeological and archival discoveries continue to reshape our understanding. The rediscovery of lost manuscripts once owned by noblewomen, the identification of female handwriting in medieval codices, and the reconstruction of dispersed libraries allow scholars to trace networks of intellectual exchange. Digital humanities projects now link marginalia, correspondence, and inventories across collections, revealing connections that were once invisible. For example, linking the libraries of Margaret of Austria, Anne of Brittany, and Catherine of Aragon shows how dynastic marriages transmitted books across Europe, embedding female learning into the fabric of international politics. These reconstructions are ongoing, but they make clear that the echoes of royal daughters' voices are louder than once assumed. Yet the silences remain deafening. For every preserved letter, countless others were destroyed. For every annotated manuscript, many more were scrubbed clean or lost in war. The dissolution of the monasteries in England obliterated thousands of volumes that might have borne traces of women's reading. Fires, wars, and deliberate censorship erased much of their intellectual presence. What survives is a patchwork, a mosaic of fragments that historians stitch together to reconstruct a story long suppressed. The very incompleteness of the record underscores the resilience of these women. Despite every effort to silence them, their voices persist in enough traces to reveal their presence. The echo of their voices teaches us not only about the past, but about the process of history itself. It reminds us that the stories we inherit are shaped by what was preserved and what was destroyed, by whose voices were recorded and whose were dismissed. For medieval and Renaissance princesses, the record is partial but powerful. Their letters, books, and portraits prove that they engaged with knowledge, often in defiance of the roles imposed upon them. To recover their stories is to hear whispers through the silence, echoes that carry across centuries to remind us that women's pursuit of learning, though hidden, was never absent. Their voices remain, faint but persistent, in the margins of manuscripts, the inventories of libraries, the brushstrokes of portraits, and the memories of chronicles, testifying that even when silenced, they found ways to endure. The memory of medieval and Renaissance princesses who sought learning beyond their prescribed roles has always been a contested space, shaped less by their own words than by the ways in which later generations chose to interpret, distort, or erase them, for in their own time they were often silenced, their manuscripts confiscated, their letters destroyed, their reputations maligned. Yet across centuries, their legacy persisted, sometimes faintly, sometimes powerfully, until modern historians began to reassemble the fragments of their intellectual lives into a fuller story. The journey from silence to legacy reveals not only how women's voices survived against the odds, but also how collective memory reflects cultural values and anxieties about knowledge, gender, and power. In the immediate aftermath of their lives, many princesses were remembered primarily for their dynastic roles as wives, mothers, or political pawns, with their learning either praised selectively to enhance dynastic prestige, or condemned if it appeared subversive. Catherine of Aragon, for example, was celebrated in early Tudor chronicles as a model of piety and learning when she defended her marriage to Henry VIII. But in Protestant propaganda, she was later cast as stubborn and outdated, her erudition reframed as obstinacy. Elizabeth I, conversely, became immortalized as the Virgin Queen, her education celebrated as proof of her exceptional rule. Yet this memory often exaggerated her uniqueness, erasing the lineage of educated women who preceded her. Marguerite de Navarre's literary works were long read as curiosities of the French Renaissance rather than as central contributions to European thought, a marginalization that only recent scholarship has begun to correct. For many others, memory was buried under silence. Juana of Castile, confined for decades, was remembered not for her learning or her early training in languages and theology, but for alleged madness. Her reputation constructed by political rivals to justify her exclusion from power. Lady Jane Grey, executed at 16, became a Protestant martyr in English memory. Her erudition reduced to a footnote in the narrative of her tragic fate, though her letters and recorded debates show her intellectual brilliance. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, was remembered in chronicles for her political intrigues and rumored scandals rather than for her role as a cultural patron who fostered poetry and learning. These distortions remind us that legacy is rarely a straightforward reflection of life. It is a reconstruction shaped by politics, propaganda, and the survival of sources as the centuries advanced. The legacy of educated princesses became entwined with broader debates about women's roles in society. In the Enlightenment, writers such as Voltaire and Montesquieu occasionally referenced historical queens and princesses as examples of female power, though often selectively, highlighting figures like Elizabeth I while dismissing others as anomalies. The 19th century, with its romantic fascination for the medieval past, revived interest in women such as Eleanor of Aquitaine and Marguerite de Navarre, portraying them in novels, operas, and paintings as symbols of passion or intrigue, but rarely acknowledging their intellectual achievements. It was not until the rise of women's history as a scholarly field in the late 20th century that the legacy of royal daughters as learners began to be systematically recovered. Historians combed archives for letters, marginalia, and inventories, re-evaluating figures who had long been dismissed as passive consorts. Through their work, Isabella of Castile re-emerged not only as a queen of conquest, but also as a shaper of female education. Margaret of Austria was recognized as a major political and cultural figure, and Christine de Pizan, though not royal, was restored to prominence as a defender of women's intellect who influenced noble and royal readers. Today, the legacy of these women challenges us to reconsider the boundaries of history. Their learning, once hidden, now stands as a reminder that intellectual ambition among women was never absent, only suppressed. Their voices, faint in chronicles but strong in the traces they left behind, resonate with modern readers who see in them the ancestors of contemporary struggles for education and equality. The preservation of their libraries, the survival of their letters, and the rediscovery of their patronage demonstrate that knowledge was always part of their identity, even when contemporaries sought to erase it. Their legacy also reshapes our understanding of dynastic politics, showing that books and ideas were as influential as armies and treaties in shaping Europe's history. From the quiet defiance of a princess reading by candlelight to the authority of a queen addressing scholars in Latin, their stories reveal a continuum of resistance and achievement that stretches across centuries. Thus, the journey from silence to legacy is not complete but ongoing. Every new manuscript, identified in an archive, every overlooked letter restored to attribution. Every reinterpretation of a chronicle expands the chorus of women's voices once thought lost. The legacy of educated princesses is not only what they achieved in their own time, but what their persistence allows us to see in ours. That history, even when written against them, could not wholly erase their pursuit of knowledge. Their silence was never absolute. Their legacy is proof that even in the darkest centuries, the light of learning endured. Looking back across the long arc of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, from the dimly lit chambers of cloisters to the radiant courts of Renaissance queens, the story of how royal daughters engaged with knowledge reveals itself as a hidden curriculum, a parallel education that operated in defiance of expectations, guarded by secrecy, shaped by risk, and yet powerful enough to alter dynasties, religions, and cultures. It was never codified, never officially sanctioned, yet it endured in whispers, in candlelit study, in forbidden manuscripts tucked beneath embroidery frames, in letters written across borders, and in libraries curated with both caution and ambition. This hidden curriculum did not look the same in every generation or kingdom. In some cases, it meant a princess gaining only the Latin needed to follow her psalter. In others, it meant mastering Cicero or Erasmus, composing her own works, or debating with theologians. At times it thrived in moments of cultural openness, as in Renaissance Italy or humanist Spain. At other times it was crushed beneath waves of censorship and suspicion, as during inquisitions and religious wars. Yet its persistence demonstrates that education was never fully denied. Even when the official curriculum restricted women to silence, mothers acted as gatekeepers, sometimes barring doors, sometimes unlocking them. Tutors risked their reputations to teach what was forbidden. Companions shared poems and romances in whispered trust. Convents served as both prisons and schools, producing abbesses who wielded pens as well as rosaries. Each of these actors helped sustain the hidden curriculum, a fragile but enduring tradition of female learning. The consequences of this parallel education were immense. Dynasties were reshaped by women who carried their learning into marriages and regencies. From Isabella of Castile's daughters, who spread humanist ideals across Europe, to Elizabeth I, whose erudition allowed her to govern as one of the most formidable monarchs of the early modern world. Wars of religion were influenced by women like Jean d'Albret, whose theological convictions were rooted in her education, and cultural renaissances were advanced by patrons like Isabella d'Este and Marguerite de Navarre, whose literacy made them central figures in the transmission of art and ideas. Even when silenced or maligned, their intellectual presence was undeniable. Juana of Castile's confinement, Lady Jane Grey's execution, and Anne Boleyn's downfall all testify to the perceived threat of female learning in political contexts. In each case, the hidden curriculum carried risks as well as rewards, but its power lay precisely in its ability to challenge boundaries. Knowledge for these women was never neutral. It was a weapon, a symbol, and a legacy. The story of the hidden curriculum also illuminates broader truths about history. The very need for secrecy, the disguising of books, the coded letters, the whispered friendships, reveals the structural anxieties of societies that feared women's intellectual independence. That fear, enshrined in church, decrees, censorship, and propaganda, ironically preserved the evidence of female learning. For the vigilance against women's education demonstrates that it existed in ways too significant to ignore. The efforts to suppress it, confinement, censorship, propaganda, stand as inverted testaments to its persistence. Modern historians recover this legacy not by uncovering great volumes of preserved testimony, but by piecing together fragments. A marginal note in a psalter, an inventory of a library, a line in a hostile chronicle, a portrait with a book clasped in a queen's hand. These fragments form a mosaic that reveals the scope of the hidden curriculum, showing that it was not an anomaly but a structural reality of medieval and Renaissance courts. Today, the significance of this history lies not only in understanding the past, but in recognizing the foundations it laid for later struggles for women's education and intellectual equality. The humanist arguments of the Renaissance, the defense of women's learning by figures like Christine de Pizan, and the examples set by educated queens and princesses all contributed to the slow transformation of cultural expectations. The hidden curriculum foreshadowed the debates of the Enlightenment, the advocacy of women like Mary Wollstonecraft, and the eventual expansion of education to women in the modern era. It demonstrates that progress was not a sudden revolution, but the accumulation of centuries of resistance. Small acts of learning and teaching that built a tradition in the shadows until it could emerge into the light. The legacy of this hidden curriculum is therefore twofold. It is a story of suppression, reminding us how many voices were lost, how many writings destroyed, how many women silenced. But it is also a story of endurance, showing how knowledge survived against opposition, carried in the minds of women who refused to forget what they had read, who taught daughters, sisters, and companions, and who left traces for us to find. From Eleanor of Aquitaine's literary court to Elizabeth I's learned sovereignty, from convent scriptoria to Renaissance libraries, the thread is unbroken. Royal daughters pursued learning, often at great cost, and in doing so they reshaped their world. Their curriculum may have been hidden, but its effects were lasting, reverberating through dynasties and centuries, until the silence itself became impossible to maintain.